John's Mole Man Productions present Man Getting Hit by Football.
This contest is over. Give that man the $10,000.
This isn't America's Funniest Home Videos.
But the ball is groin. It works at so many levels. Roll it again.
Hi, everybody, and welcome to the Springfield Google Plugs the Movie podcast for Simpson fans, brought to you by ThatShelf.com. Every episode, we talk about a movie parodied on The Simpsons. Maybe it was The Simpsons that introduced us to the film, or maybe when we finally saw it, we realized, hey, that's where that Simpson joke came from. Regardless, each week we pick one that one of us hasn't seen or hasn't seen in a while, watch it, and come together to discuss. I'm your host, Adam Scholes, and joining me as always is the Jesus Christ to my Judah Ben-Hur, my co-host Nate Storr. We're gonna get canceled now. The Beatles got canceled.
Can you tell that I write the script?
Yeah, no kidding. I don't want to be Charlton Heston.
Well,
How are you doing?
I don't want to be a faceless messiah, but, here we are.
I guess so. This week, we watched William Wyler's Ben-Hur, a film that, spoiler alert, I wasn't looking forward to watching with its near 4-hour runtime. I also didn't watch it in one sitting, so other spoiler alert.
Yeah. I mean, that's fair. And it does have an intermission, which sort of invites that.
It does have an intermission. Yeah, an intermission 2.5 hours in, the length of most regular movies.
Indeed. Yeah, the first act is longer than the second act, I think. By a good chunk.
Like Wicked. Anyway, you might remember it from such Simpson episodes as Season 3's Saturdays of Thunder, Season 4's Camp Krusty, Season 6's A Star is Burns, Season 9's The City of New York versus Homer Simpson and the two Mrs. Nahasapima Pedalons, Season 10's Simpson Bible Stories, and Season 11's Little Big Mom. So, if it wasn't obvious, this is one of those oft-covered titles for the show.
Yeah, and pretty thoroughly covered. I feel like there are a lot of different parts of this movie that get hit over the course of the first 13 seasons, with, of course, the chariot race being the number one referenced thing.
Yeah, absolutely. But today, we are going to be talking specifically about the episode A Star is Burns. One of, I know I say this all the time, but this is legitimately, I think, probably a top 5 episode, if only because it's just so littered with movie parodies, which makes it so right up my alley. And of course, also because this episode is special because it happens to be a crossover with another one of my favorite animated series, The Critic, which was created by Simpsons co-creator James L. Brooks and the former Simpsons showrunners Al Jean and Mike Reiss. The episode is also celebrating its 30th anniversary, so we thought we should pick a movie from it, and Ben-Hur is featured prominently, and since neither of us had ever seen it before, that was the movie that rose to the top. So, directed by Susie Dieter, who also directed for The Critic, written by Ken Keeler, who also wrote for The Critic, and as we sort of alluded to, this is the one where Jay Sherman comes to town, and they hold the Springfield Film Festival, and, hilarity ensues.
Adam, when you first saw this episode, did you know it was a crossover, or did you think of it as a crossover episode? Because I know that, I did not. I mean, I hadn't seen The Critic at this point. I don't think I saw this episode live. So I only saw it in syndication and then, in the DVDs. And Jay Sherman as a character, because maybe he sort of fits into this world so well, I didn't really realize that it was a crossover until a fair amount later. But what about you?
So I'm one of the 12 people who actually watched The Critic when it aired.
Wow.
And it's funny because I don't actually I remembered that The Critic existed. And I remember in middle school vaguely talking about it with friends, being like, do you remember that there was this show and it had movie parodies and it kind of looked like The Simpsons, but I couldn't remember anything about it, and it was at a time when you could not see it because the internet was still so new and DVDs weren't out yet, so it's not like people were taping this show off the air and then uploading it. And then it's so funny because we were in the 10th grade and the DVD box set came out. And this is a side tangent, but bear with me. So we went on a school field trip to Montreal, and that field trip ended up being cut short for reasons I'm not going to get into, but we ended up having to come home early because of reasons. And my parents had given me money to like go on the trip with. And because the trip was cut short, I didn't end up spending all this money. And so we stopped for lunch at a mall, and me being me, you know, I quickly ate my lunch and then like went to, it would have probably been HMV, but for whatever reason, I think it might have been Music World. Because those still existed in Canada at the time. And I saw this box set for The Critic, and I was like, that's the show. And so I remember I spent the like $50 bill still in my wallet. And I was like, if this trip is getting cut short, I might as well like get something good out of it. So I bought the DVD box set of The Critic and then headed home and like finally got to sit down and watch this show that I had this vague memory of from childhood and knew that I remembered liking, but just didn't really know much else beyond that. Although now that I say that, I think, because there was also like a webtoon that they did in the early 2000s.
Around that time.
You and I maybe had watched that and were like, oh yeah, like I totally dig this. So I knew I was going to enjoy the series again. So all this is to say, when I watched the episode, I don't think I necessarily thought of it as a crossover episode, but I definitely was aware that this was a character from another TV series. But I assumed Matt Groening was involved. I assumed it was like another Futurama type situation, that there was a reason that he was coming into the Simpsons universe. It wasn't until I was older that I realized, well, there was a reason, and that reason was that it was James L. Brooks and Al Jean and Mike Reese, and that Matt Groening famously hates this episode and wanted his name removed from it because he's like, why are we promoting a show that I am not involved in?
Yeah, which is interesting, that whole back and forth. I think Mike Reese has sort of said, like, it wasn't as big a deal as everyone made it out to be. It kind of turned into, like, a media feeding frenzy, but, like, you know, he didn't like it, which is interesting because, of course, now... Like, this was the very first crossover episode they ever did. And now they've done dozens and dozens, including ones that are other Matt Groening creations, and then others that are not at all, like Family Guy, or, I mean, The X-Files happens in our period of time, too, right?
Yeah, which is so good.
Which is an even weirder crossover because it's a live-action crossover with a cartoon.
But the difference there is that is also, yes, it's a crossover, but it's very much a parody of The X-Files, whereas this is not a parody of The Critic. It is very much taking a character from this other animated series and transplanting him into this animated series. And you have to correct me, but I'm pretty sure part of the reason they did this was because originally The Critic aired on ABC, it got canceled, Fox picked it up, and so this was sort of their way of promoting the fact that Fox had this new animated series.
Right. Yeah, this was like a little rabbit hole I went down because I didn't see it in syndication, and I'm pretty sure I was introduced to The Critic after the story you just told, right? You bought the DVD, and then I watched The Critic with you in high school. So long after it had aired at that point, really. And so I was like, okay, well, what was the relationship between The Simpsons and The Critic at this point? And it's basically what you just said. It was canceled on its original channel. And then James L. Brooks basically goes to Fox and was like, guys, you owe me one. You need to take this show. And then as part of the deal, he's sort of like, we should do a crossover. You know, it's James L. Brooks. So he has a fair amount of power and kind of just says, like, we're doing this. The interesting thing is season 2 of The Critic, as you know, was sort of almost like a reboot of the series a little bit. They changed the animation a little. They gave him a girlfriend to kind of like
soften him. They changed the character to make him likable.
Right. He's less acerbic and misanthropic in the second season. And so the first episode of season 2 of The Critic aired right after this episode of The Simpsons.
Gotcha. So this was sort of a lead kind of situation.
Which is like crazy to think about.
Yeah, for sure.
Right. Well, and like James L. Brooks, in his history with sitcoms, had done this many times, right?
Right. Of
course.
Of course. Because, like James L. Brooks is famous for doing spin-offs of his other series. People forget just how common spin-offs were. The last spin-off that I remember happening was Joey, but that didn't last. The last sort of successful spin-off that I remember existing in our time is, of course, Frasier. You know, Frasier was a character on Cheers. Cheers ends. They create Frasier, and I think Frasier's the best sitcom of the 90s. That's my hot take. But they don't really do that anymore. You know, like, I guess maybe Young Sheldon is technically but like...
Yeah, Young Sheldon's a spin-off. but it wasn't done in the same way as these other ones. It's actually more like a prequel, right?
Yes.
Whereas,
yeah,
like,
exactly. It's not like, let's take a character or a side character that was like a guest star every once in a while and give them their own show.
Yeah, the formula was you take a popular cast member and create a show around that actor, usually. And so Young Sheldon is very different because the cast is not the same. Right?
Yeah. So probably one of my favorite examples of this, and this is a James L. Brooks thing, was on the Mary Tyler Moore Show, which was very much a sitcom. It's considered one of the greatest sitcoms of all time. There's a spin-off from that, from the character Lou Grant, who I believe was like Mary Tyler Moore's boss or something. I don't really know the Mary Tyler Moore show that well, but like he worked at the network with her. But it's a spin-off where he ends up moving to Los Angeles and working for a newspaper. It becomes a drama. So it's like taking a very like a sitcom with a laugh track, taking a character and then basically doing Law and Order with them, which is just like to me is just the wildest, like biggest swing, but also just like, how cool is that? It would be like if they gave Chief Wiggum a spin-off series.
Well,
but it was going.
This is the whole thing.
Yeah, but
they did this, right? Like the Simpsons spin-off showcase. That's what the whole premise is. Is like all of these ideas of how you could sort of spin off the series. And it's funny too because of course there were actually conversations over the years about like should we spin off Springfield as like its own thing that's more focused on the townspeople.
Bill said like he really wanted to do, and the network and James L. Brooks. Ironically, James L. Brooks was not into the idea, Mr. Spinoff himself. So anyway, it's all fascinating, and I love this episode.
Truly, the sign of a great crossover is that it stands alone as like a great episode of the main show that you're watching, right? And like,
and arguably this has stood up better than the show that was the crossover, because I bet you 90% of people who watch this don't even realize the Critic existed.
It is this weird microcosm of a show that unfortunately more people don't know about, even if it's great.
I do want to just say, though, the thing that I love about the Critic, because I went back and I was rewatching some of the episodes, and I started to realize just how many movies the Critic introduced me to. I was watching it and they do a parody of Do the Right Thing, and I was like, that's it. This is where, because when I watched Do the Right Thing and he like picks up the garbage can, I'm like, what do I know this from? I know it's an iconic moment, but I'm like, I know this from something, and I could never figure it out. And it wasn't until I rewatched this episode I was like, that's what it is. They did a joke about it on the Critic. So I almost feel like we need to do a spin-off series where we cover the Critic, so we can cover the movies that The Simpsons never bothered to touch, like Do the Right Thing.
Yeah.
Because that's the thing. I think because the Critic was specifically about movies, they were able to go after more contemporary references, where The Simpsons was very much like, if we're doing a parody, we want it to be something that's withstood the test of time that everybody is going to know, whereas the Critic was, I think, intentionally going a little more contemporary references, stuff that was in the zeitgeist at the moment, because that's what that show was.
Yeah, and a little bit more like cinephilia too, right? There was a bit of a feeling of like, oh, this is like a little bit more highbrow, I guess. Because like Spike Lee, this is one of the interesting things about looking at the Simpsons parodies is like, they not only never parody a movie by Spike Lee, they use his movies sometimes as title parodies, but like late in our run, they have like an episode where they actually like really take a shot at Spike Lee because he's like on the spaceship that they're shooting into the sun.
Right. Yeah.
Ooh, there's Ross Perot, Dr. Laura, Spike Lee.
Wait a minute, they're not so great.
Which is kind of like, really? Spike Lee? He's like there with, I don't even remember, Rosie O'Donnell.
It's like Rosie O'Donnell, Tom Arnold, I want to say.
Right.
Or...
Okay, but there's Dan Quayle and Courtney Love, Tonya Harding, Al Sharpton. Tom Arnold! What the hell's going on?
Yeah, it's like a weird group of people that like Spike Lee would be there of all people. But yeah, interesting that, he actually gets a bit of a nod in The Critic. So yeah, but like, as you were saying at the beginning, this episode, because it's a crossover with The Critic, ends up being this like unbelievable platform for movie parodies too. Looking at our Simpsons movie reference database, this is like in the top 3 most parody heavy episodes, in that it has 26 total movie references, making it the second most movie reference heavy episode after Beyond Blunderdome, the one with Mel Gibson.
Right.
Great. But it also has a lot of like full-on parodies that are more than just like a little nod or a piece of dialogue or something like that. So that makes it, I think, the most parody-heavy episode in the first 13 seasons. So we got like Viva Zapata. We've got maybe The Agony and the Ecstasy, although I'm not totally sure about that one. They say it on the commentary, but I'm a little skeptical. You got Midnight Cowboy, Cabaret, E.T. the Extraterrestrial, and of course, Ben-Hur.
Drink up, Judah Ben-Hur.
You truly are the King of Kings.
Excellent.
Yeah, it's a little sad to me that we're using this episode now because essentially this is taking away my opportunity to watch Cabaret on this show. I'm willing to let that go, even though we're talking about my least interested movie that they parody in this instead. But that's fine. That's fine. That's part of the premise of the show, I suppose. All right, well, Nate, let's now get into the movie proper. For those who are maybe unfamiliar with Ben-Hur, which I guess for a certain generation, it's insane to think that there would be anybody unfamiliar with Ben-Hur, but certainly for our generation, maybe we didn't grow up watching this every single year. We've unearthed the TV guide description from CBS at 7 p.m. on Sunday, February 14th, 1971. I assume this was the initial, like, broadcast television airing of the film? Or no, 1971, it would be much later.
No, this is the first time it ever aired.
Oh, wow. Okay.
Yeah.
So there you go.
Yeah.
So this is from its television debut, and it goes as following. Television debut of the 1959 MGM production based on General Lew Wallace's novel of the early Christian era. That's it. That's the description.
Yeah. And like, this is the crazy thing about that to me is with that description, this televised viewing drew 85 million people. 85 million people.
Wow.
So it's like, obviously the reputation of this movie preceded it to the point where they didn't even really have to say very much about the movie at all in TV Guide to get people to tune in to watch this. I'm sure there were ads as well, but like everyone knew what Ben-Hur was.
This is one of those movies like Sound of Music, Gone with the Wind, Wizard of Oz that I feel like was just part of the culture, and everybody at the time saw it, and then, like you said, as soon as it comes on TV, everybody wants to see it because this is your opportunity to actually see it again, and you get to see it from the comfort of your own home. And we'll get into it. I cannot imagine what this movie looks like on a standard definition television of the era, because this is a movie very much designed to be like a pushback against the whole like idea of television, in that let's make it as grand and opulent and widescreen as possible. And the idea of like watching it on a shitty black and white like 14-inch television.
Pan and scan, baby.
Yeah, I cannot imagine what that experience would be like, but clearly 85 million people wanted to find out, so...
Yep. It became an annual tradition, a lot like the other movies that are the most referenced on The Simpsons. This was one that you would typically watch around Easter time. So, you know, which makes sense. It's interesting because it does start with the nativity, but it ends with the crucifixion. So it's sort of like, you know... Yeah, which is interesting, too, because, like, honestly, man, where do I start with this? I didn't realize this movie was as religious as it was.
Okay, interesting. Yeah.
And I think it's because of the way it's parodied on The Simpsons. Because The Simpsons never... I'm jumping ahead a little, but this is a classic example of a movie where I only knew it through The Simpsons, basically. I had no other previous relationship with it, and... The parody in A Star is Burns, of course, where, you know, he looks up and Mr. Burns is there and he gives him water, right, is Jesus in the movie. But I don't think I really realized, like, this is actually a movie that's, like, bookended by the story of Jesus, you know?
Yeah, I mean... Well, okay, that is a point that I want to discuss a little bit more when we talk more fulsomely about the film. So let's put a pin in that and come back to it, because I have some thoughts on that, but...
Yeah. And I do have one other fun fact about the televised viewing of this, which is really fascinating and speaks to what you were getting at about, like, this is like a grand, opulent production that's shot in, you know, a very wide format and all of that. Apparently, they wanted to shoot this concurrently for television.
Oh my God.
So they were going to have a second set of cameras on set to capture it in the right format for television specifically. And then, surprise, surprise, they were like, wait a second, this is really difficult and annoying and distracting to do. And they abandoned that idea.
This is hard as is, let alone to do it twice. That's wild. The precedents exist not necessarily for doing it for television, but like there are plenty of films of early cinema where they would record the sound version and the silent version concurrently.
Right.
I think there's the famous like Dracula thing where they shot it in English during the day and in Spanish at night, and allegedly the Spanish version is like vastly superior. The Phantom of the Opera, the Lon Chaney version, there were 2 cameras running, and like there's footage that remains from like the second camera that is actually in better condition than the original. So like the idea of shooting a film twice is not completely out of the realm of possibility, but for this purpose, that would just be insane. That would be insane.
And this production, it's like, you
That's
know,
what I mean.
again,
yeah, like it just no, it wouldn't work.
Yeah, for sure.
Wow.
Well,
okay.
Adam, given that, like, you know, our TV guide description didn't really explain what the hell this movie is about, how would you sum it up for our audience?
Overly long. No. A Jewish prince is scorned, and he attempts revenge and retribution before finding religion and realizing revenge isn't all it cracked up to be, I guess.
Yeah, okay, I'll take it. I think that's pretty good. Yeah.
Yeah, thanks. Because I got to be honest with you, we didn't need 4 hours to tell that story. One of my notes is that you get to the end of Act 1, which, as I mentioned earlier, is 2.5 hours long, longer than most feature films. And I'm like, really? It took us 2.5 hours to set up that this is now a revenge narrative. Like, basically, it's 2.5 hours of putting this guy through shit and then him deciding, I'm going to get revenge for this. Anyway, we'll get into it. But yeah, I think this film has some flaws. Nate, what is your background with this movie? I mean, you've kind of alluded to it, that you kind of come to it via The Simpsons, but...
Yeah, I mean, that really is pretty much it, I would say. I don't have a lot of background with the sort of like sword and sandal epics, I would say, of this era. The only connection that I could think of is that I have seen at least one other William Wyler movie. Again, he's also a bit of a blind spot for me, but I actually have mentioned it on the podcast before when we did our Full Metal Jacket episode, The Best Years of Our Lives, which... you know, comes before this movie from 1946, right after the war, and could not be a more different movie. It is like the complete opposite in every way. It's like very small scale, very naturalistic, like incredibly naturalistic for the time, dealing with contemporary social issues. It's like a completely different movie, which I would say just speaks to Wyler's versatility as a director. But that's pretty much it. Like, I don't really have a lot of background with this movie otherwise.
Interesting.
Yeah. What about you, Adam?
Well, it will come as no surprise to anybody who listens to our show that I was familiar with this film via the AFI Top 100. But also, too, so my dad and my grandfather, I wouldn't necessarily classify them as cinephiles, but certainly my grandfather had an affinity for the classics and this sort of era of filmmaking. Like, my dad introduced me to The Wizard of Oz at a very, very early age. That was my grandfather's favorite film. So, like, whenever there was like a big MGM production, I feel like I knew about it. I never had seen the film prior to this, but definitely was familiar with it because my grandfather and my dad would tell me about the chariot race sequence and like how it has this incredible scene, and you know, it was all done for real and it was crazy. And then obviously in the AFI special, it will come as no surprise to anybody that the only thing they show from this movie are scenes from the chariot race. So that was like the thing that I was familiar with. And that's also obviously the thing that goes on to be parodied by like so many things. And usually it's like the spikes on the wheels.
The
like,
wheel.
Even you could argue that even like Goldfinger is riffing on that. Like, it has spikes that come out of the Aston Martin. Like, so that's the thing that I think I knew about. But much like you, I had no idea that this was allegedly a religious picture. When I found out what the title of the book was, I was like, oh, is Ben-Hur just like another name for Jesus? Is like that what I'm getting into? Like, is this, because they're saying like a version of the greatest story ever told and blah, blah, blah. And so I was like, Okay, because I will state my knowledge of religion is entirely based on The Simpsons and Jesus Christ Superstar. Jesus! That's where I have my knowledge of Christianity. If it falls outside of what they've covered on The Simpsons or what is covered in that rock opera, I have no knowledge of it. And so I literally was going into this being like, oh, maybe Ben-Hur was like a different name for Jesus, like Jehovah is another name for God. Like, I don't know. And so I was, and then of course the movie opens with the nativity, and I was like, oh, okay, so that is what's going to happen. Spoiler alert, that's not what's going to happen. But I literally had no idea what to expect. All I knew is that when it opened with the like painting of the birth of Adam, I just instantly was like, I am not going to enjoy this. This is going to be, I don't enjoy sword and sandal movies. It's not like I'm going to be buying into the majesty and the wonder of God. So it's like, I knew this movie was not going to be for me. And we'll see if it was.
I guess I neglected to mention this because it is relevant. I did grow up going to church.
We went to Sunday school for like a couple of years, and I did spend a couple summers at, for lack of a better term, Jesus camp. Yay! But it was not because my parents were religious and wanted me to like go on a journey with God. It was just like that was the affordable camp that my friends were going to. So I went with them. Sure. And like they were like, bring out your Bibles. And I was like, I don't have a Bible. What are you talking about? Like, Bible?
Actually, you see, we are never baptized.
Fish out of water, I definitely felt.
I went to church more often than that. And more importantly, I actually got confirmed. So, okay. Yeah, which is kind of interesting because, again, I'm not a religious person these days, but it did mean that it's like I had to like read the Bible, the whole Bible, and then also talk about it with groups of people and all this sort of stuff. We actually watched Jesus Christ Superstar in my confirmation class.
Jesus! Well, you know, because it's very hip.
Yeah, we had a hip young pastor, right? So, or whatever assistant pastor.
70s.
Yeah, it was interesting though because it's like, you know, that movie's all about like it doesn't ever come down on one side or the other about whether Jesus is holy or not. He's just portrayed as a radical, right? And that was sort of the conversation.
It's also an interesting choice because the intent of the show is that it is meant to be from the perspective of Judas, which my understanding of Christianity is that they're not big fans of that guy.
Depends. It depends on the denomination. I mean, look, the Canadian United Church is a very liberal denomination of Christianity and is very open to like people being a little agnostic. And so that was kind of the tenor of the conversation. It was about the nature of doubt and all of that kind of stuff. So anyway,
that's cool.
All that to say, I have a little bit more context on the Christianity side of this movie, but that's about it.
Okay, well, Nate, take me through how this movie gets made, because I mean, it is a classic and it is considered to be best in class of these sort of sword and sandal epics of the era. But how did it all come about? The other thing I did know going into this is that this is technically a quote-unquote remake, because there previously was I want to say 1925 silent film adaptation of the book. To call it a remake, though, I think is a little disingenuous because it's a remake just like The Girl with the Dragon Tattoo is a remake. Like, it's not really a remake of the movie, it's just a different adaptation of the same source material.
Yeah, that's exactly right. Although I would say that there is some similarities in the way certain sequences are treated between the two movies.
Okay, interesting.
You know, like if you actually sent me a comparison of some of the key moments between the two movies, and like the chariot race actually has certainly some similarities in like that overhead angle of them rounding the curve, for example, is in both movies and that kind of stuff. Gotcha. But broadly, I think you're right. So, okay. We got to back up, though, and we got to talk about the book, because this book was a very big deal. So it's released in 1880, and the National Endowment for the Humanities has called this book the most influential Christian book written in the 19th century. Wow. So this was a huge, 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 huge deal. It was the best-selling book ever from its release in 1880 until Gone with the Wind took the title in 1936.
Wow.
Right?
Wow, that's
so 56 years, this was the best-selling book of all time. And then, after this movie's released, it takes back the title. Okay. So, really, really, really influential book. I have a hot take about the book and the movie and why it's so popular and all of that, but I'm going to pause on that for now.
Yeah,
Go
I
ahead.
have one other question. Who is this guy who wrote it, and why is he called General Lew Wallace? Like, is that a special honorary title, or is he an actual general? Like, what's his deal?
He was a general. He wasn't just like, like the KFC colonel.
Yeah. Well, this is what I'm saying. Like, there's precedence for people just giving themselves, honorary titles because they're, fancy people. But like, so he was an actual like military general.
Yes, he was an actual military general and a guy who did a whole bunch of other things. Like he was kind of a generalist. I think he was the governor of a state at one point.
Oh, wow. Okay.
Like he was like a bigwig, and this was sort of him dabbling in writing, basically. So,
okay. Fair enough.
Right.
Just dabbling and writes the most successful book for multiple decades. Okay.
Right. So the story goes that basically he was, considered himself a Christian, supposedly. But, he never attended or was a member of a church. Which, in the 1880s, I would think that's not, normal.
Common?
Right?
Yeah. No, 100%.
Yeah, even if you're like the most extreme kind of Protestant, you probably are involved in some kind of congregation. But supposedly, he got on a train one day with like an atheist or an agnostic person, right? And realized that he didn't know anything about Christianity, basically. And he wasn't able to kind of defend his position about like why he believes in this stuff and et cetera, et cetera. And after that, he was like, well, shit, I'm going to have to go do some research so that I can actually answer these questions. And so he goes on this journey of like researching the Bible and then researching like the Holy Land and the history of that area and all of that sort of stuff. And that research project basically evolves into this book.
Okay, that's fascinating.
Yeah. And of course, like, this is the thing. This guy is clearly good at marketing because, the whole story of him being kind of like, yeah, I'm kind of Christian, but I'm not like that committed, I guess, gave him the opportunity to sort of tell his personal story of like my experience of researching this story of Jesus and Judea and all of that sort of stuff was part of my come to Jesus moment, basically. Right. And so, Christians love a redemption story. And he really did play that up, I would say, in like the way he talked about the book and the process of it being made, which probably just boosts its credentials, I would say, in the Christian community. Right. So there were 2 silent movie adaptations of this. There was one in 1907 that was like a short, and then there was the 1925 one, which was actually the most expensive film of all time when it came out.
Wow.
The 1907 one has a different distinction, which is it actually caused a Supreme Court case that defined intellectual property in the United States, especially in movies, forever. Like, we're still living with that decision. So basically, the 1907 version was made without the consent of the author. They didn't get the rights to the book. They just made it.
Right.
And at that time, that was pretty normal. But then there was this case where essentially they were like, this is a form of copyright infringement, which now seems so obvious now. But at that time, there was no precedent. And this movie created that precedent of saying you must get an author's permission to make a movie about their book, basically.
Wow. Okay. Well, I mean, 1907, like, it's still the Wild West, right? Like, cinema is literally brand new at this point. So I did not know that.
Yeah. As for this movie, produced by MGM, and they were expecting it to be their biggest film of the year in 1954. But obviously it got delayed a few times. Wyler came on in 1957. He had worked, this is from a reputable source, but I didn't see it in many places. Supposedly he worked as an assistant director and production manager in the 1925 version of the film.
Oh, cool. That's cool.
So he actually had some experience there, which maybe speaks to some of the similarities of him maybe being like, oh yeah, the way they handled that was really good. I'm going to, take some lessons from that.
Yeah. Well, and it also would explain how you could be as close to because again, you have to remember that like in this era, home video doesn't exist. You can't just pull your copy off the wall and be like, I want to reference this. You either would have, that visceral memory of a shot, or you remember working on that shot, 25 years prior. And we're like, I want to pay tribute by doing that again.
Yeah, totally. The credit for the script goes to a guy named Carl Thunberg. But there was a lot of wrangling about the writing of this movie, and I think
this I did know.
Yeah, and I think Weiler was quite pissed off that Carlton Burke got the credit for it because it sounds like the final script was really not his words.
Right.
Famously, Weiler hated the version that came in originally from Thunberg and then hired a bunch of writers to work on it, including Gore Vidal. And Christopher Fry is the other guy that contributed a lot to the script. Gore Vidal we'll talk a little bit more about down the road, but Fry apparently was a playwright and a poet, and he's the one who kind of took all of the dialogue and made it, for lack of a better word, old-timey.
Right.
So apparently in the script originally it said something like, "Did you enjoy your dinner?" And he would rewrite it to say something like, "Was the food to your liking?" That kind of thing.
Gotcha.
So he just gave it that flavor of yes, we're in ancient times, even though, of course, it's well, they wouldn't be speaking English and they wouldn't have English accents and all of that kind of stuff. It just makes it have more gravitas, I guess.
Yeah, regal and elevated. And I have to imagine that Gore Vidal, on the other hand, is responsible for all the homoerotic subtext.
Yes, Gore Vidal is the one who added in the sort of homoerotic subtext. We could talk a little bit about that maybe when we get to the actors, because there's a whole story there.
I just will say I was watching this on my own, but my wife would come home from work and she'd, pop in and eat her dinner while I'm watching it. And even she was like, are those two guys gay? Because, they're talking real gay to each other. And I was like, well, it's a whole thing.
Yes.
There's a whole movies have homoerotic subtext, but, it's the 50s,
for
so
sure.
we can't. But yeah,
right. We can't say the quiet part out loud.
Yeah, exactly. But even my wife, who's not invested in this movie and is watching it piecemeal, is picking up on the what's going on here?
There's one scene in particular where it's almost text, I would say. Yeah. It pretty much says it explicitly, but we'll get there. So even before production started, they already knew that it was going to be the most expensive film of all time. My thinking, again, about the whole sort of idea of this being a remake of the 1925 movie, I feel like they must have consciously been everyone remembers the 1925 one, partly because it was this big production, right? Again, it held on to that distinction for a long time, for 14 years. Kind of coincidentally, the movie Ben-Hur held the record for being the most expensive movie of all time until Gone with the Wind took it from them,
yeah,
right?
Right.
So again, the books had that relationship, and then the movies had that relationship. Right. Now, this movie, by contrast, did not hold on to the record for very long, and also took it from something that had just happened as well. Because it was sort of part of this arms race. You kind of nodded at this actually earlier. TV changed everything, and movies are trying to figure out how do we adapt in this new age? And one way you can do that is you do things that TV can't, right? You make movies that are even bigger, that are on formats that are best viewed in theaters, which we still see kind of today to a certain extent. Just try to get an IMAX viewing of The Brutalist and you'll know what the strategy is all about. But basically, you had this arms race of movies in the late 40s through the 60s trying to one-up each other in terms of their budgets. So this movie cost $15 million, and it displaced The Ten Commandments, which came out 3 years before this. Okay. And then it's displaced 3 years later by Mutiny on the Bounty.
I don't think of that movie as being as grand and opulent as this. I mean, clearly it must have cost more, but I feel like that movie just takes place on a boat, whereas this movie also takes place on a boat, but it takes place on a lot of other things. But that's interesting to me. Okay, I would not have pegged Mutiny. If you had asked me, what do you think costs more money? I wouldn't have, never in a million years would I have been oh, well, it's definitely Mutiny on the Bounty was more expensive than Ben-Hur, right?
But as we know, too, the reason why a movie costs a bunch of money doesn't always show up on the screen, right? It's
very true. Very true.
Weiler, for example, he gets paid $1 million for this movie, and that was a big deal at the time, right? So just paying for certain people can be a big way that the costs get driven up. Weird logistical things, I can't say I'm that familiar with Mutiny on the Bounty, but there's a big difference between shooting on a real ship versus shooting just miniatures, right? So
yeah, for sure.
Those sorts of distinctions can drive up the cost of something in a way where you don't have 7,000 extras and you don't have 1 million props like this movie does, but you just have other things. So the thing that finally ends that run of movies trying to one up each other, 1963's Cleopatra, which was a famous flop, right?
Yeah, arguably the most famous flop in cinema history.
Right. because it doesn't make back its budget, and it has a record-setting budget. And that basically killed this arms race for 15 years. Wow. Now, do you remember what movie finally tops Cleopatra 15 years later?
Is it something we've watched or
Nope.
just discussed?
Neither.
Oh, then no, I have. I know when you tell me it's going to be like, of course, but...
Yeah. It's a movie that is interestingly absent from The Simpsons.
So what is it?
Superman. 1978.
Oh, okay. Yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah. It does make sense once you hear it. You're like, yeah, oh, of course. But interesting, too, that you go from like, a lot of these movies are like historical epics. And then in 1978, when suddenly we're like, okay, we're going to finally top the last one, it's a superhero movie.
Yeah, and it's not like that hasn't continued to be the case for the next fucking like 40 years.
Yeah, exactly. But it's like, it's gone back and forth during that period. And now we're like, at least for the last little while, we're firmly in that territory to a certain extent. Although, in terms of the most expensive budget, it's actually not superhero movies. Top grossing, definitely superhero movies.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, and also the pendulum is swinging. But the sort of cultural thing that's interesting about all this is this idea of everything old is new again, right? Like,
yes, totally.
Cinema is going through the same growing pains it went through 60 years ago. TV is no longer the threat. It's streaming that's the threat, but they're just going through the same problems that they've always had. And like, we're also starting to see the same solutions in a weird way. Like, in the 70s, you get New Hollywood, and that becomes the thing that arguably saves cinema, is this like push back against these very kind of movies. And what are we seeing right now? We're seeing a pushback against the big budget superhero movies, and like more and more indie films becoming popular and breaking through and end up making tons of money. Like we're just, it's all cyclical, and that's what's always so interesting about looking back on what feel like very sort of pieces of the era that they came out, but you realize, as George Lucas would say, it's like poetry, it rhymes.
Yeah. When you look at the Oscar nominees this year, it's hard not to feel like we're in a post-Cleopatra moment, where it's like we had this boom of like this certain way of doing things, and then you have like a year, where the model's clearly not working anymore. And now the stuff that's like rising to the top, at least critically and in terms of like what the industry thinks of all of this, it's a weird mix of stuff. And generally smaller movies, international movies too, like getting more recognition than they have in the past, partly a change in the way that things are voted on and all of that. But I feel like we are in this moment of change, and it's hard to know exactly where it's all going to land.
Totally. Speaking of how it landed, though, like this movie is obviously we're talking about it all these years later, but how did it do at the time? Did it make back its budget?
Yes, it definitely made back its budget. This is the craziest way to explain how it performed, though. This movie was seen by 98 million people, right, in theaters. Wow. And that was 55% of the U.S. population at the time.
Jeez, that's wild.
So the majority of Americans, I mean, granted, they're probably counting duplicates, right, in that, like, and people did go back and see movies back then again and again, but still, like, to think that basically the majority of Americans saw this movie in theaters is, like, wild to think about.
Yeah.
Because nothing comes close to that these days.
No, not at all.
What do you think were the other top grossing movies of this year, 1959?
Oh, gosh. I don't.
And where do you think this one placed?
I would assume that this would either be like number one or number two based on the fact that you just said 98 million people saw it. But at the same time, it also wouldn't surprise me if there was like one other movie that year that actually like eked it out, and it was like Gone with the Wind or like a re-release of The Wizard of Oz or something like that.
Yeah, good. So yes, this one did hit number one. Any other movies you can think of that might have been big hitters this year?
I don't know. This is such a blind spot period for me in cinema because it's like,
me too.
It's not so old that it's like the 30s and 40s classics, but it's also not that like 60s, 70s period where you get New Hollywood and you get like all the experimentation and like these movies that completely changed the course of cinema, but also, for lack of a better term, don't feel like old movies. Like it's that classic thing that we've discussed of like, when do movies start to feel modern? So it's like the 50s. If it's not a Hitchcock movie that came out that I specifically actively chose to watch, I just don't know many movies from this period, to be honest. So I have no idea.
Okay.
What could be in the top 10 at this point.
So I'll give you a couple hints. The first one is there is a Hitchcock in this top 10. But which one?
That's what I was thinking. But I'm like, it's not Vertigo. Is it
Nope.
Vertigo? Okay, it's not Vertigo, yeah. And it's not Rear Window because that was 54. Yeah, I don't know. What would it, Rope? No, Rope is 60, I think.
Not in the top 10, I don't think.
Oh, jeez. Okay, I don't know. What is it?
North by Northwest.
Of course it's North by Northwest. Yes, right. Of course. Okay.
So that's number 7 on this list.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, that's okay. So
Yeah.
that's Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, and here's another clue for you. When you think of the 50s in America, there are a few key people that you think about in Hollywood. One of those key people is definitely represented on this list, and it's a woman.
Okay. Oh, a Marilyn Monroe picture?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. I'm gonna say it. 7 Year Itch.
Good guess, but no.
Gentlemen Prefer Blondes.
Nope.
God damn it! And it's not Some Like It Hot. Some Like It Hot.
Some Like It Hot. Number
Some
3.
Like It Hot. Okay. I thought that, for whatever reason, I thought that movie was earlier than 59. Okay.
Yeah.
And then the other person who I think of in this that is definitely making movies at this time that are like, there's got to be a Disney picture in there.
I don't think so.
No?
Well, no. I
Like
don't think so.
even a live action Disney.
It might be. I have to admit, I don't know my live action Disney super well. So one of these could be. There's definitely some things that would fall in that category of movie of like, it's a zany comedy.
Okay. So, well, run me through this. Okay. So number 1, Ben-Hur. Number 2,
The Shaggy Dog.
oh yeah, that's a live action Disney. That's definitely.
Is it? Okay.
Yeah. That's definitely a
Yeah.
Disney.
Yeah.
That makes sense.
Yes, this is a movie about a young man who turns into a dog. Okay.
Let's go Walt Disney all over it.
Right. Number 3, Some Like It Hot. Number 4, Operation Petticoat, which apparently is a submarine movie that is also a comedy.
It sounds like a war picture. Again, not my cup of tea, but fair enough.
Yeah. Anytime I look at one of these lists, I'm like, 50% of these are made up. Okay. Number 5, Pillow Talk.
Okay, cool.
Which I'm like, I don't know that one. 6, Imitation of Life. This is one that I am familiar with. I think it is primarily about the issue of passing as a black person in white society.
Okay.
Number 7, North by Northwest. Number 8, The Nun's Story, which I think is an Audrey Hepburn flick.
Okay. Yeah.
And then,
you're right.
Yeah. Number 9, A Hole in the Head. Do you know that one?
No, can't say that I do.
Sinatra. It's a Sinatra movie.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
Great.
I only know the title. I don't know anything else about it. And then number 10, Solomon and Sheba, which is another sort of sword and sandal situation.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
Interesting.
Yeah, this is such a blind spot for me. I have now seen 2 of these movies and had only seen 1 prior to this episode. So there you go. So this movie did win big at the Academy Awards. It got 11 wins, which is not topped until Titanic.
Yeah, I was going to say, I think that was the other reason I knew this movie, is that it like held the record for the most wins, and probably most nominations too, but like definitely most wins until Titanic comes along. And then I think Chicago ties it, or maybe Chicago's only 10 because of the doubling for Best Actress. I can't remember, but I remember that was the big thing, was that Chicago also like got a record number of nominations.
Right. That might be nominations, I think.
Yeah.
And of course, it does win Best Picture. So, it's got that distinction. In terms of the sort of franchise legacy of this, it was remade in 2016, believe it or not. God help us all.
I do remember when that came out and seeing posters for it and going, really? Like, now?
Yeah. Yep. And the same year, it also got a sequel called...
Really?
Called In the Name of Ben-Hur.
Okay.
Can you guess what the plot of this movie might be?
No, I can't.
Okay, yeah, because it's not exactly a movie that begs for a sequel for a bunch of reasons. Any story that is bookended very clearly by something like the Bible is like, this story is done. It ends with the crucifixion. How much more done could it be? But here's the plot of the 2016 sequel. Retired gladiator Judah Ben-Hur helps a group of young vigilantes in their quest to remove the Romans from their homeland once and for all.
Okay, so that might actually be more up my alley than this movie was. But
something tells me that this movie is not going to be up your alley. It has 2.7 stars on IMDb.
I don't know. Is it less than the runtime of this movie? Because if nothing else, that might convince me.
That's true. The remake probably is also lower in runtime at the very least.
Yeah. Okay. Well, okay. So now that we've done all this table setting, let's get into it and our thoughts, feelings, and emotions. Overall thoughts. Didn't like it. No, I'm being facetious. Let's maybe start with the thing that I wanted to come back to, which is this whole idea of like the storytelling, the religiosity. The full title of the book and arguably the film is Ben-Hur, A Tale of the Christ. So, again, I'm going into this being like, okay, this is going to be about Christ, fine. And Christ is definitely featured in the film, but like as this like tertiary character. Like this is very much Ben-Hur's life story. And so I'm like, what do you mean a tale of the Christ? It's not a tale of the Christ is just like Christ is around. He's present and like he pops up at random. But like I think that was one of my like weird bugaboos about this is like you keep talking about how this is this like great religious novel or one of the great stories of, and I'm like, no, it's not. It's about this other guy who happens to like interact with him, but no time is given or dedicated to Christ's actual story. Like he pops up to give him water, and like we'll talk about that because I think that sequence and the way it's handled knowing how it's handled now makes the Simpsons handling of it that much funnier. I didn't realize that it was a joke until I saw this. Right. And we'll get into that. But so he shows up there, and then again, so obviously there's the nativity, which opens the film, and it is handled decently, I guess. It's a nice representation of that.
Probably one of the best film depictions of it of all time. I mean, I can't think of another one, but I can't imagine that any other movie does it better than this, probably.
There's the Sermon on the Mount, I think. And then you get, obviously, the trial before Pilate. And Pilate is a character in this movie, though, like, I never really thought he was played for evil. Right. And then finally, like, obviously the crucifixion. But that's it! So, like, 4 set pieces where Jesus shows up. Like...
Yeah.
And so I guess all of this is to say, the thing I couldn't stop thinking about the whole time was Life of Brian, the Monty Python movie.
Blessed are the cheesemakers!
What's so special about the cheesemakers?
And I'm like, that's what this is. The Life of Brian is as much about Christ as this movie is. Like, what do you mean this is the greatest? It doesn't make sense to me. I'm like, what are people talking about? It's about a Jew. Like, it's not even about, like, it's not even about, like, I just, anyway.
Well, to be fair, it's about the conversion of a Jew. That's what I would say the arc of it is.
I guess.
Yeah.
But that didn't really come across to
It's something that I thought about a lot watching this movie and trying to understand what the Christian narrative in this movie is. Because you're right. I have a bunch of questions about this. So the first one is, why are we focusing on Ben-Hur as a way to think about Jesus? And I think, like, there are some moments in this that make it pretty clear. So you're right. I think it is the Sermon on the Mount. In that scene, you are watching Ben-Hur watch the Sermon on the Mount from a distance, and there are a bunch of matching shots where you see Jesus in the distance and Ben-Hur in the foreground, and then the perspective swaps almost exactly, and you see Ben-Hur in the distance, and you see Jesus in the foreground talking to his disciples, right? And I think what that's trying to tell you is these are parallel stories and parallel paths that are happening in the same place at the same time. They're sort of in conversation with each other. Now, my issue is, I think what that conversation actually is really messy. And I'm not sure that it's actually clear to me what it's saying about Jesus, Christianity, Christian morality, or any of those things. And like, again, not that I personally care about that, but those are the stakes of this movie. This movie sets up those stakes. And so whether or not it delivers on it is a big deal, right, in terms of whether it's successful or not. Now, all that said, this is my hot take on why this book and why this movie are so successful and popular, is that essentially this is a boy's story. This is an adventure story. It's a revenge story that is wrapped in Christian clothing as a way to give Christians a pass, an alibi, an excuse to enjoy. Basically, like, this is the other thing. This story is the Count of Monte Cristo. It is the same fucking story.
Yeah, totally.
It's exactly the same story. It's just that you just put it in the time of Jesus and wrap it around with like the nativity and the crucifixion as a way to like give it a different flavor, and maybe say something bigger about morality, Christianity, Jesus, all of those things. Again, I'm not sure whether it actually has much to say, and I could be totally wrong. I'm sure there are scholars that have gone over this a million times and have lots to say about this, but for me, as someone who's not like an expert in this, it was a little lost on me. You know, we'll come back to it at the end, but I guess my big question about this whole movie is, does Judah Ben-Hur change? And does he actually get redemption in this or not, you know? Or are we just getting our cake and being able to eat it too? That's the big question.
And again, I will concede that this could just simply be a matter of perspective. Like, we're coming at this from a more modern lens, a more secular society, a more secular lens. Like, I have not read the Bible. I am not familiar with all the stories of the Bible, all the parables, blah, blah, blah. So, like, maybe when you watch this as someone who is better versed in your Christianity, you can see the parallels between other narratives. I don't know. And again, we're watching this in 2025. So, like, other things have done this. We're watching this with a great deal of distance. So, like, I will concede that maybe certain things are lost on us just because we're so far removed from it. I don't know. But I'm kind of with you in that, like, I don't necessarily understand what the film is trying to say. And I really don't understand how you can call this a story of Christ when it's real. It's not. Like, it's not about him. It's about this other guy. And, like, sure, you maybe can start drawing parallels. And maybe that's why they changed the title of the film. I don't know.
Right.
But it's like, it's Mr. Douglas's "You expected cake and you were given pie." Like,
right.
That's not what this is. That's not what this movie is. It's very clearly about this other guy.
Yeah. The most generous reading of it is that Ben-Hur is a sinner who then discovers redemption, right? And this sort of vengeance that drives him is something that he has to overcome, and he does that by discovering Jesus. That would be the most generous sort of Christian reading, I would think, of this movie, but I'm not sure that really bears out when you're watching it. Maybe we'll come back to it at the end and see whether our feelings have changed, because it really is baked into the whole story and how it plays out.
Okay, well, let's talk about our story of Christ, our lead character, Mr. Judah Ben-Hur. Mister? I guess he would be a mister. As played by Charlton Heston.
Prince Judah Ben-Hur.
Yeah, Prince. Yeah, you're right. He's a Jewish prince. Played by Charlton Heston, who we previously saw in Planet of the Apes. And we had some strong feelings about him and his performance. What's your take, Nate?
This is going to be a little interesting given what you just said. I think he's a lot better in Planet of the Apes. Because I actually don't mind that performance. I think he's doing his Charlton Heston thing, but I think he's actually so subdued in this performance in a certain way, relatively speaking, that I find his performance very boring, actually. I cannot believe that he won Best Actor in a Leading Role for this performance. It is crazy to me.
I will contrast that by saying I wouldn't necessarily call his performance subdued. I think he's incredibly big in this movie, but he just lacks any range. Like, he has one mode and he's just doing that the whole way. I think he's so badly miscast. I think you need somebody who you empathize with and who can show emotion and range and depth. Yeah. He's so one-dimensional, and I'm willing to concede that maybe it's just like I am clouded by my judgment of him as a person and can't see past that.
Yeah.
And again, having the 60 years of history of knowing like who this guy becomes, like, it just does not allow me to get through that.
Yeah, his most famous role for you is Bowling for Columbine.
Yeah, which, I'm sorry, it always will be. Like, and he's burned any goodwill he had. And again, it's tricky because, like, one of my other notes was, like, you know, the credits for this movie roll, and I'm like, I do not recognize a single name in these credits. And it sort of speaks to maybe my blind spot of just the era. but I'm like, there is no one else in this movie that I recognize. He's the only recognizable name. It's like this awkward thing of like, okay, well, if I were to recast him, who would I recast him with? Like, the only other people I can think of who are making movies like leading men at the time is like, well, it couldn't be Cary Grant and it couldn't be Jimmy Stewart. So it's like
Frank Sinatra?
Else? Yeah, like that's the thing. It's like the other big names I think of, I'm like, well, they would also be terrible in this role.
Yeah.
So I don't really know who I would replace him with, but he's the title character. You're going to spend the entire movie with this guy. And if he's flat and lifeless, the whole movie is affected. And what I will say is that I don't think the other actors in this movie are bad. Yes, their performances are quite large, and I think that's just the style of the time.
Which was the style at the time?
I have a lot of the same problems with his performance that I had with Planet of the Apes, which is just like, I don't find this guy likable. I don't find this guy charming. You're asking me to go on a ride with him, and I'm kind of indifferent because I don't like the character at all.
Yeah.
But my main takeaway was like, oh, wow, it's interesting. He really looks like Eddie Redmayne, like, at this age. To the point that my wife, who came in as she was, like, sort of watching it, she goes to me, he kind of looks like Eddie Redmayne, eh? And I was like, I literally just wrote that in my notes. Like, how weird is it that we both picked up on it? But that was, like, my one takeaway was, like, young Charlton Heston kind of looks like Eddie Redmayne. I just spent the rest of the movie being like, you know what'd be really good in this movie? Eddie Redmayne. He'd be pretty good.
Yeah, no, I take your point. It's a tough spot because this is considered his lane at this point in time. You know, he's coming off the 10 Commandments where he plays Moses, which is almost certainly like one of the reasons he gets cast in this. I think he also worked with Wyler on his previous movie as well that was like still in post-production when this was being shot, called The Big Country. But like, yeah, this is like his thing, but I much prefer him in the almost like Twilight Zone sci-fi mode of like the horror of it all. I can't believe I'm stuck in this crazy world. I like that version of Charlton Heston much better than the Sword and Sandals version because it's like he's a big actor, and I actually don't think this script gives him a lot of opportunities to really show the best version of his bigness. You know what I mean? Like, because he's not great at the sad stuff. Apparently, he couldn't cry on set, so Wyler was just like, just cover your eyes. Like, those scenes are not particularly great. I think he has no chemistry with his counterpart.
None.
What's her name? Esther.
And I'm not invested in that relationship as a result.
No.
Because I just...
In fact, there were some bad vibes in that relationship. He, like, frees her as a slave, basically, and then immediately is like, all right, well, now we could be together. She doesn't seem that into it in that scene. So it's like that whole thing is kind of weird. The best scenes in Planet of the Apes are where he's screaming, right? And yelling, like, and he doesn't get to do that in this.
Well, and I want to talk about the chemistry a little bit because it circles back to something we've already touched on. I would argue the people who he has the most chemistry with happen to be the boys.
Of course.
Because, like, and that scene where he first meets Masala again and they have their, like, huggy, very homoerotic reconnection, I guess we should say.
Yes.
I buy that relationship far more than I buy any of the relationships with the women or even his family in this, because those female characters are so badly drawn, which I recognize as just like, that was the style at the time, as Grandpa Simpson would say.
Give me 5 P's for a quarter, you'd say.
But let's maybe talk about Masala, because again, that's another very big performance, but it's working for me because like he's meant to be this tyrant, evil monster.
Yeah, totally. I agree. I think he's actually doing a great job. Stephen Boyd is like not someone who I'm familiar with at all.
No, me neither.
You know, I was looking at like what else had he done before this. Not a lot of note, I would say. This is probably his biggest role, and you can tell because a lot of what he ends up doing for the rest of his career is movies that are ripoffs of Ben-Hur. But other things that he did do were The Fantastic Voyage from 1966.
My dad loves that movie.
That's like a classic movie, I feel like, of the Simpsons writers era. And
yeah, totally.
Another interesting movie where it's like, I have seen that movie parodied in like every single cartoon I watched growing up did a parody of The Fantastic Voyage at some point, including like, of course, like Magic School Bus. You know, it's not even a parody. It's just a ripoff almost. But,
even even video games have like parodied that movie. Like I've played video games that are directly riffing on Fantastic Voyage. So...
Totally. And the other one that he's in is The Oscar, which is like a forgotten movie, I feel like, from 66, but it is actually spoofed on The Simpsons in Bart's Dog Gets an F. It's one of those ones that like maybe Mike Reiss brought to the table. He has this like interesting sort of film knowledge of stuff that's a little outside of the genre world. But I'll have to say, like, not that much other stuff that he's in, but I agree. I think he's pretty great in this. He does exactly what he needs to do in the role, right?
Yeah.
And he won Best Supporting Actor for it. At the Golden Globes, though, and not at the Oscars.
Right.
But yeah, their relationship definitely has some homoerotic tension. And again, like in that scene that you were talking about where they come back, there is a line that I think Masala gives that's something about unrequited love that is very much driving at this, again, to the point where it is almost text.
Oh, is there anything so sad as unrequited love?
Apparently, yeah, that was inserted by Gore Vidal when he was working on the script. He actually told Stephen Boyd that this was his intent, but did not tell Charlton Heston because he figured he probably wouldn't approve or wouldn't get it.
He was like, I don't think he's going to like this. Yeah,
basically.
That tracks.
Yeah. So then in the 90s, there was actually like a bit of a feud between Vidal and Heston about whether or not this was true, because Vidal's autobiography came out and they were fighting about it on, all these different venues. So I thought that was pretty funny, but like, it's very obvious, I would say. There's no way to read this that doesn't have that as part of it, in my opinion.
Well, as I said, my wife, who didn't watch the entire film and would like pop in at certain scenes, even she was picking up, and not even just between him and Masala, but like there's a couple other male characters, specifically the like father figure who adopts him.
Quintus Arias.
My wife literally was like, what's going on here? Like, he's adopting him? Aren't they lovers? And I was like, look, I can't explain this. Like, none of it makes any sense to me. Like, it's all very complicated.
Well, the adoption thing is just like, there's only so many ways to get someone out of slavery. And so I think the adoption is just a way to like get him to be free. But yeah, there's definitely a bit of that vibe there, because like, you know, at one point, basically, Ben-Hur saves Quintus Arias's life, and then he's sort of indebted to him, and he brings him to Rome, and he gets to be, like, part of his family. But, like, interestingly, that actor, Jack Hawkins, who plays Quintus Arias, second billed. He gets billed above Masala.
Yeah.
And I think it's because he's one of the people who would have been recognizable at the time, and, like, kind of brings in some of the credibility. So he's been in movies since 1930, and he was also in The Bridge on the River Kwai, which is like a good, you know, obviously this is David Lean's corner, right? Like he gets to do movies like this for his whole career, basically. And so, you know, it makes sense that you'd have some actors that kind of cross over from that movie to this movie. And then he goes on to do like Lawrence of Arabia, and yeah, anyway, the rest is history.
One of the biggest things that I understand because of the time why, but literally in my notes, it was probably like an hour and a half in, I was like, oh, finally, some people of color. And then like another half hour later, I was like, oh, and now we've reached the brown face part of the film. Like,
yes.
For a movie set in Judea, or I guess it's Rome, but that part of the world, this is a very white-heavy movie, which, again, I recognize that was the style at the time, as Grandpa Simpson says.
Yes. The proverbial onion on the belt.
Which was the style at the time.
Watching it now, you kind of go, oh, boy.
And it's important to note that brownface role, Sheik Ederim, won that actor Best Supporting Role at the Academy Awards.
And I was like, he's very clearly wearing a lot of bronzer. But then I was like, I don't know, I should maybe double check. Is he possibly like... You know, no, he's a guy
Griffith?
from he's from Wales. I didn't realize his name was Hugh Griffith. Yeah, no, he's a Welshman. Like it's no. Again, I'm not judging the filmmakers for this because I know that was just like,
That's
how
Hollywood
it was done. But boy, you notice it. Like you really notice it in this movie,
right?
And maybe it's just because I'm so bored by everything else that I'm just like paying attention to it. But yeah, oh boy.
Yeah, but as we know from The Mask of Zorro, there is a proud history of Welsh people playing other ethnicities on screen.
Yes, exactly. Okay, well, let's maybe talk about something I do like about this movie.
Yeah.
Because I feel like I've not been generous. Let's talk about the look and feel of it, because I have to give this movie credit. It looks stunning. I think I texted you this. It was like, holy shit, there's so many extras, because like at the time, if you wanted to have a big crowd of people, your options were either do a matte painting or just hire a shitload of people and put them in the shot. And that's what it seems like they opted for that. So
they do both, and they often like bring it together as a way to, and it really works. Like it really works fantastic, even by today's standards. There are very few moments where you're like, that looks a little janky. Even like the miniature work on the ocean, like it's not perfect, but it's pretty damn good.
But I was going to talk about this later, but since you've brought it up, I literally in my notes I'm like, how did they do this? They must be doing like a mixture of miniatures and like rear screen projection, but like that whole sequence of the ship going down and then like them floating, like when he rescues Quintus Arius, like I'm pretty astute with like how special effects are done in movies, but I was like, I genuinely don't know what techniques they're doing here. Like this is incredibly impressive.
Yeah, totally.
Which, like, for a movie from 1959 to sort of stand back and go, like, how'd they do this? That's saying something. And, like, there's a lot of moments in this movie of me going, how did they do that? Like, I just had to assume they did it for real because that's just what they did. And it's astonishing. Like, the imagery that they are able to get out of this is remarkable.
Totally. It's both the big spectacle moments are really great, and that's really a feat of, like, set design, production design, and also just like the massive resources that went into this movie and a lot of it actually showing up on the screen. But there's also all these little moments in this movie, I think, that are really incredible. Like there are some great moments of lighting and framing in this movie that I think are just like spectacular. And, one of the things which is sort of made fun of on The Simpsons a little bit is just the use of lighting whenever people are in the presence of Jesus, right? This is their sort of workaround is you never see Jesus' face. And the person who played him, not even given credit in the cast, right?
And,
but
and for the most part, it's handled fairly well, though there's... I think it's the crucifixion scene, or maybe it's the scene... No, maybe it's when he's with Pilate. I can't remember.
The court scene that you're thinking of.
Yeah, where there's literally just like, they've drawn black over his face.
Yeah.
And it's very noticeable in the like modern HD prints. Maybe it was less noticeable like in a theater in 1959. But it's just like they handle it very artfully throughout, and then you get to this one moment, and I'm like, oh, okay, could have tried a little harder there, maybe. But
right, totally. Yeah, they just like burned the print over his face, basically. Yeah. But I think the way that they handle it usually is like they show him from the back, but then the people who are in his presence have this sort of like angelic light on them, which I think works pretty well. It's not so obvious or corny, because I feel like it's almost a trope at this point. It's pretty subtle, but it does give you this sense of like, this is a special person that they're in the presence of.
Totally.
I also think there's some really cool framing moments in this. And most of them are Judah Ben-Hur entering a space. It's like Judah Ben-Hur walks into the room. He's framed by the doorway. He's completely in silhouette at that point, and then walks into the room and he's walking into like a light source. So you see him. It's so dramatic and beautiful. There's one shot in particular, I think it's after he's saved Quintus Arius and he's getting on the other boat and he's looking down into the galley where all of the people are still rowing, and you're sort of looking up at him through the grate that's sort of separating the two areas. There's so much stuff like that in this that is just like really satisfying cinematography,
Yeah. Well, I mean, let's talk a little bit about the cinematography, because I think it bears discussion. So this was shot in Ultra Panavision 70, a response to CinemaScope, which was owned by 20th Century Fox. So this is the thing, is like, there's a bunch of different widescreen formats, but at the time, because of the studio system, each one was sort of owned by the studio that develops it. So it's not like there's this one format that everybody's using. Everything is sort of proprietary in a weird way. But all of this was sort of in response to Cinerama, which was this like hyper wide, like literally so wide the screen was curved. But the way those films were shot, and it becomes actually a problem in modern day, how do you now screen these movies? But they were shot with 3 cameras, and then the 3 images are sort of stitched together on site when you're projecting, and you get this super, super wide image. But the problem that sort of comes out of that is that now in modern day, like on a home video format, how do you show an image that was designed to be watched on a slight curve? Like, do you stretch the image? Do you crop it? Like, there's all sorts of things that come out of that. So this was part of the thing that they were trying to solve with these other sort of wide cinemascope solutions, was like, okay, we want to come up with an image that is wide enough to fill a Cinerama frame, but doesn't require us to have 3 cameras. So they basically, like, without getting into all the nitty gritty, but they figure out how they can basically take an anamorphic image, which is like squeezing the image onto a 70 millimeter frame. And that results in the massive aspect ratio of 2.75 to 1.
Wow.
Now, 35 millimeter versions of this were 2.55 to 1, but that's still way wider than the sort of traditional scope image, which is 2.35 to 1. And that still exists today. Like, if you see a scope image, it's most likely going to be 2.35 to 1, maybe 2.40. But in that sort of range is standard now.
And it's like, you know, again, just to like pause and just really emphasize this for a moment, because it's like, you know, we're throwing out a lot of numbers, but like the bottom line is the aspect ratio of this movie is almost 3 times as wide as it is tall. Like, exactly. And it really does show. It's like, that's how you get these incredible vistas of these set pieces where they're marching into Rome or the chariot race. Like, it really takes advantage of these huge sets with tons and tons of extras.
But what's really interesting to me is how the film tries to deal with this ultra-wide frame, which I didn't do a ton of research on this, but one of the things I did read was that William Wyler hated this. He hated that he had to shoot in this ultra-wide form, because he's like, where the f*** do I place anything? How am I filling this frame? This frame is massive, and you're telling me, like, what am I going to do? And so what I think is interesting is that when he achieves it, he fills it with extras, and he fills it with these massive sets. And he uses lighting in a way that these sword and sandal movies, in my mind anyway, tend not to do. One of the things I sort of hate about biblical epics is I think they look incredibly flat and dull. Because they're shot in the desert with just the sun. And like for example, if you look at a movie like Jesus Christ Superstar, which we've sort of alluded to before, I think that movie looks terrible because it's just everything is just flatly lit out in the desert. There's no contrast. There's no actual use of like chiaroscuro and artistry. And I think that this movie genuinely makes use of creative lighting in a way that movies like this tend not to. Like, there are moments that really do sort of look like a Baroque painting where the light is focused where it needs to be. Or as you say, like Judah Ben-Hur walks into the light or something like that. That is not something I'm used to seeing in these kind of movies. And I think this film deserves credit for. However, I think there's also a lot of moments where I kept noticing a weird editing tick where it would be like it cuts to ostensibly another shot that's maybe a little bit closer, but it's not close enough to be a close-up, because how do you compose a close-up for a 275 image?
Oh, Sergio Leone can tell you.
Well, yes, exactly. There are people who eventually figure this out. But the end result is there were multiple moments in this where I'm like, I know we've cut, but it doesn't feel like the shot has changed enough. It's jarring.
It's like a jump cut.
Yeah, it feels like a jump cut, but it's not. But it's just because it's cutting from like a medium to a slightly closer medium, but not that much. And it's a little bit off axis, and it feels really... And this happens multiple times throughout the movie. So I find the editing in this movie, outside of a specific sequence that we're going to talk about, the editing is really weird to me. I wonder how much of that just comes down to the fact that Wyler was really struggling with frame composition and how to adjust that frame composition for those edits, because when you think about it, like, that is so much space to fill, and it would be really complicated to do.
I think that's definitely part of it. I think the other component is that there were also a lot of people, like, looking at the production history, that were like cast in roles that never appear in this movie. And so to me, that also says that there was probably also a lot of content that was cut, and because it's already super long, and I think they shot even more stuff. So it's like they may also just have had to cut things down after the fact, and it didn't quite work with what was shot.
I read the original rough cut was like 4.5 hours long.
Yeah.
Which, like, when you actually think about it, I know a lot of movies where they had rough cuts that were 4.5 hours long and then came in at 90 minutes. So, like, to come in at 4.5 hours originally and then get down to 3.5 or almost 4, Maybe they didn't cut as much as they should have, but yeah, clearly there's a bunch of stuff that is missing or was taken out in that effort to get that 4.5 hours down to whatever the final runtime of the movie was. But yeah, it's just, when I started thinking about it, I was like, I think it's more related to just like the difficulty of composing frames for this. Like, I know Martin Scorsese has talked about, like, when you shoot in scope, like, you have to figure out interesting ways to compose close-ups because that's such a wide frame. And if you do what you would normally do in, like, a standard flat image or even, like, a square image, it's not going to translate properly because you've got so much more room to fill. So I'm willing to give it a little bit of grace as a result. But I think for the most part, it handles it incredibly well. And then finding out that the director was like, I don't even want to do this, makes it all the more impressive that, like, under duress, he manages to compose such incredible frames.
Totally. Well, what I would like to do with the rest of our time is just kind of go through some of the key moments in this movie through the lens of all of the different Simpsons parodies of this movie.
Great, let's do it.
Because it really does cover most of the most memorable parts. So it's a really great way to kind of get a feel for like what actually happens in this movie. So I did want to start with the opening credits, which actually come a little bit into the movie. But this was sort of something that, like, actually watching this now, I feel like I have an opinion on. So in A Star Is Burns, on the commentary, I think they're watching that moment in the episode and sort of are like, I think this is from The Agony and the Ecstasy, right? And that movie is about the painting of the Sistine Chapel, and that's what you're seeing behind the credits is The Birth of Adam, which is part of that mural. Yeah. And that movie also stars Charlton Heston. It makes sense. It's like an easy mistake to make. But if you actually look at the opening credits of that movie, they don't actually have The Birth of Adam. It's a completely different thing. It's people like mining a quarry or something like that.
Yeah, I'm pulling it up right now. And that sequence from A Star Is Burns is definitely riffing on the opening title sequence of Ben-Hur. Like, no question.
Yeah, it's like a little misremembered thing. But like, it's notable that is actually riffing off of this movie and not Agony and Ecstasy. But yeah, otherwise, that's like a pretty fun opening credit sequence. It's exactly what you want out of this kind of movie, being like, this is going to be the biggest thing ever.
Yes.
Right? The score, The Birth of Adam, even the font, the like all caps serif font with like beveling and shadows. It's like, it just feels enormous.
But it's important to note that it comes after this, like, prologue, which is the Nativity. Yeah. Obviously, The Simpsons has covered the Nativity, and whether or not they're specifically referencing Ben-Hur, like, I don't know. But it is interesting that the film makes the choice to open with that. I found a website dedicated to sort of these, like, 70mm and roadshow productions, and it had the text from, like, I guess the guidebook or the handbook that would have been delivered to theaters to sort of explain, how do you do this? Because it's like, there is an overture, which was like, again, this movie isn't long enough. Let's just have several minutes of music.
Yeah, it's like 6 minutes. Explain, like, it's really long.
And I have you ever actually been to, like, seen a roadshow screening of anything?
No. Actually, when I saw Best Years of Our Lives, it was at the Stanford Theater, and they have the full, like, organ intermission and all of that stuff. So it's like a little bit of a taste of it, but it wasn't a movie like this that was designed for roadshow.
Right. Okay, so when I worked at TIFF, whenever they screen 2001: A Space Odyssey, they do it as the 70mm roadshow version, which is like, cool. So that has an overture, but it's specifically meant to be played over curtains drawn. There's specific instructions of when you open the curtains and so on and so forth. There's the intermission, music plays during the, et cetera, et cetera. Very similar to this. This movie has an overture, it has an intermission, and in that guidebook, it gives very specific instructions of, this is what you do, this is what plays over the curtains, this is when you're to draw the curtain. Cool. And one of the things it talks about is how no one is to be admitted into the theater during the nativity sequence, lest we spoil the majesty of the Christ's birth or whatever. Like, it's like, but it's like very specifically written instructions of not just like, don't do this, but like, you can't do this because, and it just sort of speaks to, like, again, the religiosity of the era that this is coming out in, that, like, even in the instructions, like, the studio is saying, we dare not sully this beautiful, important religious moment. So
it's like walking into church in the middle of a sermon. You shall not.
Yeah. It shall not be done. And just to think about now, I went and saw a movie last night where they didn't even turn the lights off until like 5 minutes into the movie. So it's just like, times have changed so much.
Yeah.
But
I mean, it's funny because I did go see The Brutalist in theaters, and of course it does have an overture and an intermission,
Right.
which was pretty interesting to see how they handle it. And they like lights come up during intermission and people come out. One of the nice touches, of course, that they add, because it's, a modern movie, is they put a timer on the screen.
Yes. So you know how
saying
much
the
could
amount
be
of time left, which is like, that makes a lot of sense that you know exactly how long you have. But that's so cool that there's like actual instructions for how you do it, not just like, you just put it on the screen.
Yeah, we'll have to put it in the show notes because it's fun to read. And again, like this whole website is dedicated to these kind of films. So like,
Cool.
My assumption is that they have these instructions for other things like 2001, like Gone with the Wind, these other movies that were presented in this sort of like elevated fashion, which I'm sure it's only a matter of time before we get back to that. It seems like that trend is already starting to happen. So
totally. People want an experience if they're going out to the movie. So the next sort of big scene that is parodied on The Simpsons is the water scene, right? Where Jesus gives Judah Ben-Hur the water kind of in the desert. It's actually in Nazareth in the movie. They kind of like jam those two scenes together in an interesting way. Basically, the setup is after Judah and Masala have their sort of semi-homoerotic reunion, they get into a big fight because basically Masala is now the tribune of Judea, and he's responsible with like bringing this province under Roman rule and kind of like quelling a rebellion that's happening, partially because of John the Baptist and Jesus, right? And also just like Jews wanting their freedom. Judah is a prince of this area and basically is like, no, I won't help you do that. And so Masala betrays him, and that's kind of what kicks off this whole movie. And Judah ends up being a prisoner and then a slave and goes through all of these sort of trials and tribulations. And, the first time that we kind of see him enslaved is this scene in the desert that's parodied in A Star Is Burns, where he's like walking with all the other slaves and the Roman soldiers through the desert. In the movie, they get to Nazareth, where Jesus is, basically. Then he collapses close to a well, and Jesus comes out and gives him water from the well.
More specifically, other slaves are getting water, and the Romans specifically refuse to allow water to Judah Ben-Hur for reasons that I don't remember or care about.
No, it's just because Masala's like singled him out as being like,
and so
extra
and then
punishment.
And then you get the scene where Jesus gives him water. And this is where I said, I think it's really interesting because it kind of opened up that scene in A Star Is Burns, which I just thought was a parody. I now get is actually a joke, because the whole joke is that in Ben-Hur, we don't see Jesus. He doesn't say anything.
Right.
We don't see his face. Whereas in A Star Is Burns, we see Mr. Burns' face. He speaks.
Yes.
He has the heavenly light come down on him. And then you have Charlton Heston call out, "You truly are the King of Kings."
Yeah.
The joke is the fact that, like, this movie has the respect to not even show Christ's face, whereas Burns is so full of himself that he's not only going to show his face, he's going to give him lines and then specifically call him out for being so excellent.
He also gives him a bottle of water.
Yes. Well, yes, there's that too. So it's interesting how like something that before I read one way, now that I actually have the full context for, I understand. And maybe I'm overthinking it, and that wasn't the writer's intent in The Simpsons. But like to me, it makes it so much more layered and that much funnier now that I understand the difference between it and the source material.
Totally. So the next sort of sequence, and I kind of forget honestly how this happens, but I guess he's being like taken through the desert so he can serve on this ship. Is that right? Am I remembering that right?
I think so. Something like he's a slave, and so he ends up on a slave ship essentially.
Yeah. So he ends up on this Roman warship, and he's rowing with all of the other slaves. And that's another place where The Simpsons actually kind of makes fun of this. In Camp Krusty, when the camp is basically turned into a sweatshop, and you have is it Kearney who's banging the drum?
I'm pretty sure it's Kearney. Yeah.
Our Arts and Crafts Center is, in actuality, a Dickensian workhouse.
Yeah, that's another moment that is like shot for shot, a sort of parody of this scene. The getup that Kearney's wearing and all of that is like out of this scene in the movie.
And another true, like, one of these aha moments that we talk about in the opening of our show. Like, I'm watching the movie and I see it and I go, oh, oh my God, that's what that is. Like, I didn't know that. Like, it was nice to go into this being like, oh, we're doing it because the Star is Burns thing and like, okay, yeah, blah, blah, blah. But this was like a nice one of these like added, oh, I didn't realize that was a parody and now I do. So that was kind of cool.
Yeah, this is an interesting one because I feel like the water scene, it makes sense that would be a thing you parody, partly because like the whole thing with the Burns parody is that like he's casting himself in the most desirable roles, including Jesus Christ himself, right?
Yeah, exactly.
But also that is like the crux of this movie's story is that scene, and it keeps coming back again and again and again. So it's like a really obvious thing you'd kind of give a nod to. The chariot race, it's the most memorable sequence in this whole movie.
It's the most iconic sequence, without question.
Right. So, and it's been parodied by so many other things, like you said, or nodded to in all these other movies and TV. So it makes sense.
Yeah.
This is the one where I'm kind of like, why this scene? What is it about this scene that they were like, let's parody that? When you were watching this as like in the 70s or in the 50s when it first came out, was this a sequence that really stuck out to people? Because like, if I were going to cut something, I know like in the story, you need to get him to
from
Rome.
point A to point B. Yeah, exactly.
From point A to point B, right? And he meets this, I've already forgotten his name, but this older Roman general guy who then like adopts him, right? He meets him on the boat. So like that has to happen somehow. But like if I was going to cut a sequence, it would probably be this, because it's just like, you already get him in the desert. We already know he's a slave. He's suffering, all of that kind of stuff. And this just kind of drives the point home and then makes that story connection. Mm-hmm. I don't know. Maybe I'm missing something. Like, is there something about this that feels like iconic, exciting, memorable that I'm just not getting?
Yeah, I'm with you. It is funny that it ends up being this thing that they reference because it feels like a throwaway moment, as you say. But clearly there was something about it that resonated enough or stuck in the minds of them enough to be like, oh, let's riff on that. Because you're right. Like normally, again, when doing a parody, you tend to pick like iconic moments, memorable moments, and this to me didn't seem like. But like, yeah, it is an interesting choice.
Battle speed, Hortator. Battle speed.
Yeah, I mean, I guess like the thing that we haven't said is like in this scene, there is this sort of moment where the guy who's going to adopt him, who's a Roman soldier of some kind, right? He's sort of testing all of the slaves, and particularly Judah Ben-Hur, and keeps like telling them to like row faster and faster, and like the drum speeds up in order to kind of like increase the pace. But then Judah doesn't break, right? Like that's the big sort of like takeaway from that scene is like he's going to earn the respect of this guy, and then he actually unshackles him, which saves him when they're in the battle. That's why he's able to save the general or whatever later, right? And so like maybe that's it, is it's like that moment of like Judah really standing up for himself and like earning the respect of the soldier. That's what makes that so critical. But like, yeah, it didn't jump out to me in the same way as like these other scenes that are parodied, I guess.
Yeah.
So the next thing, again, I didn't know that this movie had such a big subplot about lepers.
Yeah.
Because again, like The Simpsons does nod to this, but it's just like one line of dialogue in the episode Little Big Mom where Maude Flanders is like,
"Oh no, that's leprosy. Remember those scary lepers in Ben-Hur?
You saw Ben-Hur without me?"
And again, it's a funny thing that they choose to reference about this movie, which maybe it just kind of fit into that storyline because that's the one where Bart and Homer think they have leprosy. I can't even remember how or why that happens.
You've got leprosy.
Lisa, well, it's because the ghost of Lucille Ball tells Lisa to play a prank on them, and she gives them fake leprosy. Because of course it is.
Okay, that's pretty good.
But I mean, it's like I guess leprosy was a big like concern back in Judean times.
Yeah.
But and
it plays a role in the Bible too, like Jesus and the lepers. I feel like
Yeah. But it's certainly one of those things where it's like it doesn't really come up that much in modern day. So if the Simpsons are going with it, then they have to obviously reference some sort of biblical epic. But
yeah, so basically the subplot here is like, Judah basically gets to, like, he saves the soldier's life. He comes to Rome, gets adopted, and like is finally back in the good graces of society. Basically, he gets his freedom. He ends up inheriting the wealth of this soldier, and then he comes back to Judea, and everything's a mess. Right? We find out that his family has leprosy, but they're so ashamed that they don't want him to know, and they tell Esther, his now wife, not to tell him, and she doesn't.
Yeah.
That's
she tells them that they're dead, and that's what sort of
Yeah.
sets off the revenge narrative of, I need to avenge my dead mother and sister. It's used as sort of this plot device, which, again, by this point, we're 2.5 hours into the movie, and I am pretty much completely checked out because it's too much. Certainly serves as decent enough motivation for him to go on his revenge, though there's any number of other reasons for him to want revenge. But I suppose thinking that your mother and sister died while in captivity is enough reason to want to go after your old best friend / possible lover.
Yeah. Yes, well put. I was thinking a little bit about like why Maude thinks the lepers are scary. I don't think they're particularly scary in this movie, but the one thing that does give you the tip off that maybe it's supposed to be scary is there is this music cue whenever they say the word lepers. Yeah, it's probably the corniest part of this movie is just the like, it's almost like a dun-dun, like lepers. I'm currently reading this book, Making Movies by Sidney Lumet. Great book.
It's such a good book,
Yeah. And he has a great term for this, which is Mickey Mousing.
Yes.
Which I love. I'd never heard that before, but basically just the idea that like the score is exactly following the action on screen.
Yes.
And it's kind of doubling it in a way that's actually not helpful. It kind of makes it corny. So I'm wondering if that's kind of like what they're nodding at too, is just the idea that the movie really wants you to think the lepers are scary. So that's like the end of Act 1, basically.
Yeah.
Right?
2.5 hours in, we finally get to the end of Act 1 and we get an intermission. And at that point I say, okay, I'm going to finish this movie tomorrow.
Yeah. And we come back and Act 2 is basically just like set up for this chariot race, which they'd spend a lot of time setting up. This is how you can get your revenge, right? Yeah. Well, I forget what they say, but like in the arena, there is no law or something like that. So basically the idea is, well, you could kill him if you want during this race. Yeah. But it's like, there isn't really a lot else that happens at the beginning that's of note. It's just set up for this incredible sequence, which is of course the highlight of the whole movie, parodied 3 times in the first 13 seasons of The Simpsons, at least. Yeah. You got Saturdays of Thunder.
Like the arrogant Roman and Judah Ben-Hur, these modern charioteers battle ferociously. No quarter given, none asked.
You've got The City of New York versus Homer Simpson. Ow! Yeah, and you've got the 2, this is Nahasapina Pedalons.
Oh, no, you don't.
Yes, I do.
The thing that everyone parodies is the chariots racing each other side by side and then like the wheels touching or a spiky wheel or, you know, a wheel kind of like grinding against the side of a car. That moment has been parodied in this and in so many other things in film history.
With that being said, you know, so this is the iconic moment. You've probably seen clips of it. You've seen parodies of it. How did you feel watching it actually unfold in this sequence? Because you kind of knew how it was going to play out. Were you sort of like less invested or did you find yourself invested? Because I have to say, for me, I did not enjoy watching this movie apart from this one sequence. Like, I genuinely think this 20, 30-minute like, it's pretty long, is a 5-star masterpiece in a otherwise pretty forgettable film. If this sequence didn't happen, I don't know that it would have withstood the test of time. But, like, I think this is the sequence that allows this film to continue on to become the iconic thing that people are going to continue to reference because like this sets the gold standard and in some cases like still remains to be topped. Like you will never see a sequence that is this visceral ever again because like
I agree.
Watching it I'm like, how the did they do this? Like I have to assume they just did it for real and we're like, we might lose some extras, but like that's what they're paid for. Like there's a shot where a guy like flips over and then is like run over by multiple chariots and I literally am like, how did they do that? Like, is that guy dead? Yeah. Like, that guy might be dead. I don't know.
Yeah, I totally agree. This type of scene is never going to be topped again, period. No. Because they're never going to build this set again, have that many extras again, have 80 horses involved in shooting this again, including like, I think it's like 30 on screen at once. It's like, never again. Never again. It would all be CGI.
I was tempted to watch the remakes version of the chariots. And I think I've seen clips of it in those like Corridor Crew videos. Like I've definitely seen it crop up online. But just to be like, how much worse? Because there's no way it's going to be as good. Like it's definitely going to be worse. But like how much worse is it? And I don't want to feed into the like classic CGI is ruining everything narrative, but like there is something to be said for doing it for real, whether or not it's advised, and the viscerality and just the sheer level of spectacle that you get as a result of that.
Yeah. It's not to say that we can't do amazing things now that rival this in terms of quality or excitement or cinematicness. It's just that whether it's better or worse, this is like a singular moment in history where something like this could be shot in this way. That will never happen again, as far as I can tell, right? Like, there's just no way.
One of the things that's so interesting to me, too, is the sheer simplicity of the sequence, because, like, ultimately, it's just, like, a bunch of people running around in a circle. Yes, there's a guy with a chariot with spikes, which, like, how is that allowed? Like, one guy gets to do that? Like, that seems a little
unfair. They say there's no law.
But...
No law in the arena.
Yeah. So, but, like, why did no one else think to do? Anyway, it's just, like, there's some, logistics.
It's because it's Greek.
Yeah, okay, so there you go. But all this to say, like, I've never really understood the appeal of watching, like, F1 racing. Like, this idea of just, like, cars just drive around in a circle for several hours. Like, that doesn't seem that thrilling to me. And again, this sequence, you don't have these crazy camera moves. It's all basically plays out mostly in masters with the occasional cut in to see who the chariot racer is. And there's some back and forth stuff between Judah and Masala. But like, it is relatively simple, but that almost makes it that much more thrilling because it's like, it's the classic, like, Fosse just lets the camera stand so someone can dance. It's like, they're not trying
what you wanted of
crazy...
dance moves, fight moves. Yeah. Like, if it's actually happening, if they're actually doing it, just show it.
And that's what they do, and it's thrilling. Even coming back and, like, sitting down to watch this movie, like, I've taken a break, I'm watching it the next night, I'm coming in, like, halfway through the movie, and I'm sitting down and genuinely thrilled through the entire sequence. It's astonishing because the rest of the movie couldn't be more opposite for me. But what I think is kind of interesting about that is that the best sequence of the movie allegedly wasn't directed by William Wyler, maybe?
Well, so it's not allegedly, it's a fact. He delegated it to the second unit, right?
Right.
And so you have two directors, Andrew Martin, who was responsible for the actors and the story and all of that. And then you have Yakima Kanut, who's responsible for the stunts and dealing with all of the danger, basically, of this sequence where you have, like, again, tons and tons of live animals, people moving at high speeds, and then these set pieces where, like, it's like someone's going to get trampled or, someone's going to fall off of the chariot. Like, all that stuff needs to be considered.
But then as soon as someone falls off, a bunch of people are going to run in and rescue him before the next horse comes to trample that. Like, it's just, it's an incredible
and you can see it all in the
choreography.
shot.
Yeah, it's nuts. Yeah. It's absolutely nuts.
Yeah, totally. And to the point of what's real and what's not and how dangerous is this. So, there's like the one moment where Ben-Hur flips over his chariot onto the front of it because he goes over like the remains of another chariot and then he climbs back on. That was an accident.
Oh my God.
That was an accident.
Jesus
it was just, I might have even been Yakima Kanut, or it was like one of the stunt people was doing this, and they accidentally went over that chariot garbage.
Right.
And that all just actually happened, and they had to write it in. And, like, could have died easily, right?
That's
so
insane.
there was danger here, but it seems like overall, from what I read at least, there weren't, like, really serious injuries or deaths, or even the horses, which is kind of shocking. So... yeah, I mean, what a sequence. What I will say is that the whole time I was thinking about Star Wars Episode 1.
Oh, okay, interesting.
Famously, the pod racing sequence is based on this. And
I guess, I never would have put that together, but that makes sense. Yes, of course it would have to be.
Yeah, and the main giveaway is that, and this is such a brilliant choice, is that the score completely drops out at this point. Right?
Totally.
Which feels like such a modern choice. It's the opposite of Mickey Mousing, of being like, nope, the sound is going to do all of the work here, and you're just going to hear the horses, hear the wheels, hear the people, hear the crashes, like, and that's where you're going to get the juice of this scene. And Lucas just wholesale rips that off in Episode 1, and it really works. It's the best part of that movie. Right?
You got it. Lucas, for all his faults, the man knows when and what to steal and why. Like, that is arguably what he's best at.
Yes. But because of that, I was also thinking about, retrospectively, are there other things in this movie that Lucas is taking from? And the more I thought about it, again, it's like you could read anything into Star Wars because it's taking from everything and also synthesizing everything into something new. But what I was thinking about with this movie in particular is a couple things. Number one, all the Romans have British accents and all the Jews have American accents. Right? And again, it's like, that's a bit of a trope. Don't know where that trope starts, but that was a conscious decision in this movie that then we know Lucas takes from in other ways. So that's interesting. And of course, the whole, like, you know, Roman Empire and then, like, you know, the outlying areas under their control is very, very Star Wars-y. But then the biggest thing, I think, when you think about the Force, it's sort of famous that, like, it's, you know, Eastern philosophies, like, all mushed together, and this sort of, you know, like, chi, the energy all around us and all of that kind of stuff. But the other thing that's very important about the Force is that it has a light side and a dark side. And the light side is all about, like, mercy and no emotion and all of this sort of stuff. And the dark side is all about hatred and vengeance. And when you think about what motivates Anakin Skywalker to turn to the dark side, it's very similar to what goes on in this movie with Ben-Hur, right? He's consumed by vengeance. And so, like, I was thinking about a lot about that and whether the sort of morality of this movie, which again is like maybe not even that much about Christianity in a certain way, but more just about like the lightness and the darkness and temptation. And it's got some redemption to it, which is a very Christian idea, but in other ways it's just kind of like almost like the Force, right? Like Christianity as the Force. So anyway, I went down a whole rabbit hole thinking about
that's
how
fascinating.
whether this had an influence on Lucas.
The only other thing I wanted to touch on with this sequence is, of course, there's a certain very famous person who was involved in it, though he wasn't very famous at the time. Nate, do you want to talk about who happened to be a camera operator and assistant on this sequence? Because he's very important to you, I know.
Yes, indeed. So this movie was shot in Italy because they wanted to shoot in, I think, like Libya and other places, but they couldn't get the rights. And so they shot in Italy, which, you know, is also a relatively cheap place, I think, by American standards to shoot things. And so one Sergio Leone was on the crew, particularly for this part of the movie, working under, I think it was under Martin. He's known as a storyteller, and I think he kind of always exaggerated his role in this sequence. It seems like he didn't have actually like a huge role in sort of shaping the sequence, but there was a story that he would tell and then was corroborated by other sources that may be sort of like a little bit of insight into his experience and development as a filmmaker, because this is like early in his career. And so William Wyler was like a real perfectionist, and he was famous for like wanting to do many, many takes of like shots, you know, much like other directors we could talk about. But apparently, you know, as I mentioned, he had just finished working on this movie, The Big Country, before Ben-Hur, but the movie wasn't done. He actually delegated it to, again, like, I think the editor, Robert Swink, to finish it, and then just like left and started working on Ben-Hur. And when he was on the set of Ben-Hur, he was like, you know what? I'm not happy with this one shot. And the movie happened to also star Charlton Heston. And so they're shooting the chariot race sequence one day, and he comes up to Charlton Heston and is basically like, you know, Chuck, I would really like to reshoot this shot from Big Country. And he's basically like, are you serious? Are we actually going to do this right now? And so Charlton Heston got into his cowboy outfit and shot a pickup for this movie in the Roman Colosseum.
Oh, wow. Okay.
But
crazy.
Sergio Leone is there for this whole back and forth between these two guys. And this is like the first time that Sergio Leone sees a Western being shot like right in front of him. So that's pretty cool.
Formative. So he's like, ooh, a cowboy in Italy.
Yeah.
But like, I could make something like that.
Right. Maybe. But, you know, I will say, too, number one, the aspect ratio of this movie is very much like where Sergio Leone goes. I don't know if it's exactly the same aspect ratio, but that super wide aspect ratio is very much his vibe. But also, I would say a lot of those entrance shots that we were talking about, the framing of Judah Ben-Hur in this movie, is very similar to some of the framing that you see in his movies, and even the stances. Like there are a couple moments where Judah Ben-Hur kind of like adjusts his body so that like one of his legs is sort of pointing a little bit to the side, right? And it's very noticeable. Those moments happen in Sergio Leone movies, particularly with Clint Eastwood's characters. So like, again, I'm curious whether there's an influence there.
Well, I forgot to mention this, but Ultra Panavision 70 kind of, it falls out of favor. But do you know who is the person who sort of like revives it more recently? If you connect the dots, you should be able to figure this out.
Are you talking about Sergio Leone, or are you talking about someone else?
I'm talking about someone else, but Sergio Leone.
Quentin Tarantino?
Yes, Quentin Tarantino. So the Hateful Eight, these like his movies that are very directly referencing Leone movies are shot in the format that Ben-Hur was shot in. And so it's all like, it's all tied. It is like, again, it's all cyclical. Which is kind of interesting. So
amazing. I mean, again, what an amazing sequence. I mean, I don't know if there's anything else to say, but just like an astonishing piece of filmmaking. And I think where we would differ is like, I do feel like for the most part, the build up to this in the movie works for me. It's a little long, mostly I think just because it's dated. Like it's a different way of making these things and we wouldn't make it this way now. But like overall, I did enjoy the stuff leading up to this enough that I feel like it earned it. The stakes felt really high in the moment as well. And like, you really care about this character. You care about Masala too. And like what's going to happen. And yeah, it pays off emotionally as well as in terms of the action for me.
But do you think the rest of the movie pays off emotionally, or does it sort of peter out after this? Because
it definitely peters out. This is where they're basically like, oh, right. And then the Jesus stuff.
Yeah, we got to wrap this thing up. We're coming up on 4 hours here.
Yeah. And this is supposed to be a Christian tale. So yeah. What are we going to do with that? Oh, right. Crucifix. Yeah, right. The Passion of the Christ and all that stuff. And then some more lepers. Yeah, it does kind of peter out for me a fair amount here. The nice thing in the script is like you get the payoff of the water, right? The water is this recurring motif, right? Mm-hmm. Jesus gave him water in the desert. And during the Passion of the Christ, Judah gets to give him water back and sort of show his mercy and generosity to a stranger. Because again, he's basically never met Jesus. They've just had this like brief exchange.
Yes, but he does recognize that it's the man who gave him water before. He's doing it as a sort of thank you, I would say, which is still like, I mean,
well, that's the thing.
Not admirable, but
right. But that's the thing is it's not the same as what Jesus did because it's that's just tit for tat, right? This is someone he recognized who then he helps. It's not a stranger, and you could argue that like his mercy and willingness to like touch his family who are experiencing leprosy are maybe have a little bit of Christianity to them, but also it's like it's his family.
Exactly.
Right? It's not all the other folks.
This is what I'm saying. I don't understand what this movie is trying to tell me because I don't think this guy is like anywhere near like a hero. Not to bring it back to Monty Python, but the whole thing about Life of Brian is that like the Brian character is actually admirable and he's trying to show people the error of their ways, albeit through a more modern lens. But this idea of like, don't just do what other people tell you to do because they're telling you to do it. Like, do what you want to do. Like, follow your heart, follow your instincts. But this movie isn't doing any of that shit. Like, it's just... And I think that's ultimately what it comes down to for me is like, I don't understand what this movie is trying to say outside of like, obviously Christ is good, but like, I know that already and he's not the main character.
For sure. And I think like, this is what my big takeaway is, I think, is that at the end of the day, I think this story is more about letting audiences have their cake and eat it too. Ben-Hur essentially like kills Masala indirectly, admittedly, but kills Masala. He goes into the arena knowing that that's a possibility and then follows through and Masala dies, right? He doesn't stick him with a sword, but like that's how it works out. And he seems to have no remorse about that at all. Right?
No, he's got his revenge. And
he's got his revenge. He has no shame, no remorse, no guilt.
Yeah, and the film also doesn't do the thing that most revenge narratives do, which is like, okay, now you've got your revenge, now what? Like, it doesn't. He doesn't have to then grapple with the fact that I actually don't feel any better having gotten my revenge, and revenge is meaningless. Like, there's none of that there.
Exactly, and like that's the thing that's really missing is like you have no sense of his interior life in the latter part of this this movie.
Yeah.
And like that's sort of the end. He gets what he wants. And then like his family is magically healed by the crucifixion. They no longer have leprosy. Ta-da! Right. Yeah.
Which also makes no sense. I'm sorry. It makes no sense. Like I've reread
it's just a miracle.
No, but like the Wikipedia article very specifically says that it starts to rain. The rain hits Jesus, then it pools into a lake, and then they're healed by the rain. But I'm like, that's not how. That doesn't make any sense. Like,
well,
it's not like.
But also, I don't think that's not how it happens in the movie. Like, because they are healed in the cave, aren't they? They realize they
come out of the cave, and it's the rainwater falling on them is what heals them.
Well,
at least that was
whatever. I mean, to me, it's sort of like it's a magic storm. A magic storm happens.
But I'm just saying they set up the fact because they show the water pooling in this river. Like, if anything, they should have gone to the river, bathed in the river, and it cured us. Like,
right, they're baptized. I mean, like, I think the thing with the water was like that was my favorite part of the ending was just because it ends up being very abstract. Like, you suddenly at the end of this movie that is very, very traditional in many ways. You just get you get several shots in a row of just landscape with water pooling, running, no people. And I found it very moving, very, very beautiful. But I just took it as metaphorical. I didn't make any connection between the water falls on Jesus and then the water goes down the river and then the rain falls on them and then they get healed. I was just like, there's a magic storm and Jesus's whatever benevolence washes the land clean or whatever, or like runs out into the land. Like that was sort of the way that I read it. And I would prefer that reading.
Fair enough.
I don't need to make it make sense.
maybe I'm overthinking it, but it's just like,
or Wikipedia is.
To your point, it's just, and then like Ben-Hur comes home, allegedly having understood the error of his ways. His family's healed. Now they can ride off into the sunset. Everybody wins.
Yeah.
Like, it's just talk about petering out and like an unsatisfying conclusion for me anyway. Like, it just, I was like, I agree. 4 hours to get to that? Like, that's it? Like, I really felt like Homer in that moment. Like, that's it? Like, I just.
Well, maybe that's a good segue since I think we've basically talked about everything in this movie that we want to talk about. Yeah. Let's move on to our Simpsons speed round. So, Adam, are there any moments in this film that feel like Simpsons jokes but aren't?
No. Like, this is a pretty humorless movie. Like, I mean, I guess the brown face element. Like, I could see the Simpsons sort of making reference to the fact that, like, oh, all these Indians are played by white people or something like that. Like, that is a joke that they could tackle, but there's no, like, humorous moment in the movie that, to me, feels Simpsons-y. What about for you?
I definitely had the brown face on my list as well.
Okay, yes.
But a couple others that I had on here are, the baton of victory definitely made me think of the inanimate carbon rod. Okay. On multiple occasions, for whatever reason, a limp object is used to knock someone out.
Okay.
So, like, at one point, someone uses a chain to knock someone out, and at another point, someone uses, like, a ring of keys, which I just thought was like, why aren't you using solid objects to knock people out? Like, just pick up a chunk of wood or a rock or something.
Yeah, there's plenty of rocks
just felt like a strange.
Yeah, totally.
Yeah, that felt like a strange running gag. And then the other thing is just Masala, in particular, was giving me some strong Troy McClure vibes. And
I mean, like, even Heston, like...
And Heston, too,
Like, 100% Troy McClure... Well, I mean, he was in the Erotic Adventures of Hercules. I was going to say, he's definitely been in a Ben-Hur-esque epic throughout his filmography. There's no doubt in my mind.
Yeah, and I feel like Stephen Boyd, no offense to him, but looking at the rest of his career, it feels like a bit of a Troy McClure-ish type career.
Yeah, totally.
So, like, I could see him, falling into that. Okay, Adam, did you learn anything about The Simpsons from this movie?
I alluded to it earlier. It added an extra layer to that Burns as Jesus moment. This film is very explicit about not revealing who Jesus is, and that film is very explicit about making it Mr. Burns. So it's
excellent.
How about you?
For me, it just reaffirmed something that I feel like I've been learning over the last year, but like really drove it home, which is that like the intertwined histories of TV and film are really important to understanding the parodies on The Simpsons. To me, I'm almost positive one of the reasons why this movie was parodied is that it ran on TV every year. Right?
Yeah, exactly.
Because it came out probably before most of the writers were born, or at the very least they'd be very, very young and wouldn't have seen it in theaters. The TV iteration is probably one of the main ways that a lot of them experienced it.
Definitely.
Okay. Does this movie still have some juice for more Simpsons parodies?
I would say yes, just in so much as like epics, and then obviously all the Christian stuff. Like, there's plenty here that they can remine. I don't know that there's any other iconic moments to do a true out and out like parody of, but certainly you can play in this well again, and I'm sure they have. Like, I haven't watched all 36 seasons of it, but it wouldn't surprise me at all to find out that there's more references to Ben-Hur or Ben-Hur type films in the show.
Sure. I actually said no. And I think it's partly because they have done the biblical epic thing so much. It was such a thing that, especially in the first 13 seasons, they hit many, many times. And I agree that I'm not sure there's any other moments or characters that jump out to me too much in this movie that I'm like, oh man, I wish they had more of that. If anything, I miss Troy McClure and I miss.
I was going to say, that's the thing is if Phil Hartman hadn't passed away at such an early age, I feel like that character could have they would have kept doing it, and they would have had more opportunities to put him in, again, the erotic adventures of Hercules. We maybe would have finally got to see what that looks like. So, it is an unfortunate loss that character is no longer ripe for parody.
For sure. Okay, similar note. Are there any characters in this movie that could become a recurring Simpsons side character?
I mean, again, maybe what's his name?
The Sheik. That's what I said too.
maybe the Sheik. But
probably a little politically incorrect, I'd say.
Yeah,
but
yeah. I don't know that maybe
territory they've unfortunately already trod on. So
yes, exactly.
Yeah. Are there other movies by this director or in this franchise that The Simpsons should parody?
Well, apparently there is a Ben-Hur too, but no, I was looking through William Wyler's filmography, and I don't know most of his films, but he did apparently direct Funny Girl, and that feels like that could be a Simpsons episode at some point, totally. Lisa playing the Barbra Streisand roles.
Yeah, I was thinking definitely the Ben-Hur sequel feels like something that they could have some fun with. But in terms of William Wyler, again, as I said earlier, I'm also not super familiar with his filmography, but I was looking through it, and this one caught my eye just because of the summary. How to Steal $1 Million. The daughter of an art forger teams up with a burglar to steal one of her father's forgeries and protect his secret. I mean, it's that could be a great Simpsons episode.
Yeah, that's definitely a Simpsons episode. So there you go. You found it. Okay, Nate. Verdicts. What do you think? Does this movie stink, as Jay Sherman would say? Do the strengths outweigh the weaknesses? What do you think?
For me, strengths outweigh the weaknesses. I take your point. It is a very slow movie. Today, it would be made very differently in a bunch of ways. This is the trade-off, right? Is that it's the things we love about this movie could never be done today again. And the things that we don't like about this movie are also a product of that time, right? And so for me, though, despite the fact that I think Charlton Heston is maybe the weakest link, or the acting, many of the actors aren't quite hitting it for me. When him and Esther are not really working, and Masala's not on screen for a bunch of the time, it's a little tough. But I think that the filmmaking carried me through the whole story effectively enough that it got me to that moment in the second act where we get the chariot race that I'm satisfied by the end of it, despite definitely some weaknesses. How about you?
Well, as I said, I think the chariot race is a 5-star masterpiece in a otherwise, 2-star movie. I don't think the strengths outweigh the weaknesses for me personally. I think it is very beautifully shot. Well, here's what I would say. If you're at home and you haven't seen this movie, I don't think you need to watch the whole thing. I think you can just watch the chariot race, because again, especially in terms of the plot and the plot development and then the subsequent payoff of the chariot race, you don't really get any payoff from it. So I think you could kind of watch it as a self-contained action sequence and still be just as enthralled without having the buildup of who are these two characters and why does it matter? It'll still be thrilling. So with that being said, if you were to find yourself in a position to go and see this film projected and shown the way it was intended to be seen in like a roadshow production or whatever, then I would say yes, check it out. I've spoken about this a lot, about struggling to watch movies at home. My enjoyment of this movie, or at least my tolerance for this movie, probably would have been elevated by a theatrical screening. It's why I've never watched 2001 at home. I've seen 2001 multiple times, but I've only ever watched it screened in a cinema because I just don't want to see it any other way. So if you find yourself in a position to be able to do that, 100% take that opportunity. Otherwise, I don't know that you need to, like, unless you're really into biblical epics. But like, and that's why it's so fascinating to me that like this movie would be aired on television over and over again and people would watch it every year, because it's just like, really, you'd sit through this like year after year, and we at least get to watch it in a proper like widescreen format on a widescreen television. I do not know how this movie would translate to a 1970s standard definition television. Like, I just
no idea.
You would be missing like you would literally be missing like 60% of the image.
Yeah,
like
more than half the picture.
So
Totally.
I don't know how it would translate.
Yeah, I wonder if people just turned it on in the background and kind of like tuned in and out. You know, I feel like a lot of those annual ones like that's how people did it. You just turn it on because it's what you do. It's like the Macy's Thanksgiving Day Parade. You put it on, you like tune in and out. You're doing something else at the same time. I don't know. Fascinating.
It's also interesting. We didn't talk about this, but it is also interesting that like the time it airs, like it has its broadcast television debut, is like at the start of, or arguably peak, New Hollywood. Like, it is the polar opposite of what is happening in cinema is what's being aired on television. And like, what is that dichotomy? Are like people like, oh, this is a nice throwback to like when movies were so different. I don't know. Like, again, it's really interesting.
It's generational too, right? It's like, you know, because New Hollywood, maybe it's the young adults are the ones who are going to the theater to see those movies. And then when you're thinking about TV, it's like, you know, people who are settled in their family life and their kids who are watching it. And maybe
my grandfather is probably watching this on television while my dad is out going to see The French Connection, right? Like, it's
right.
Yeah,
and like a grandchild or maybe like a younger sibling might be the one who's watching it with their parent or grandparent or something like that. Yeah. Fascinating.
Interesting. Well, okay. Extra credit. Nate, what would you pair with this?
I mean, okay. So I would say Star Wars Episode 1 is a very interesting pairing, but has a similar ratio of good moments to bad moments.
Totally. Yeah. At least it's shorter. It's definitely shorter.
Yeah, it is shorter. It is shorter. But if you want like two potentially tough watches, depending on your tolerance for like lengthy epics, that would be one way you could go.
That's what this movie was missing, was Jar Jar Binks. That would have elevated.
I've always thought that. Yeah, absolutely. The other option, which is actually like makes a lot of sense and addresses a lot of the things that you're saying, is Gladiator, right? Which is like also a revenge story that's a sword and sandals epic. Takes out all of the religiosity. And
also a movie I didn't like.
Yeah. I rewatched it on a plane recently and was surprised by how engrossed I was by it. And I remembered kind of like thinking it was okay the first time I saw it. And then rewatching it in a bad setting, I was like, oh, okay. Yeah. I actually like that better than I remembered. So
it's interesting because I never saw it when it was first released. So I was I watched it like 20 years later and I was just like, like I don't really understand why this movie was such a massive hit, and then they made a Lego sequel to it. So, but that's just, again, I don't like this genre. Like that's part of it too. I just like it does nothing for me. So
yeah. But this is like what I'll say about Gladiator is it's like if you wanted more sequences like the chariot race,
100%,
and less Jesus and a shorter runtime, it's going to give you all of those things. But it also gives you the like really hammy acting. The like, instead of sort of Christianity and Judaism, the broader context is like democracy and all of that stuff. So like it kind of gets to the same place, but it does it much faster and with a lot more action.
And with a CGI Oliver Reed, because he died halfway through the movie, so they had to figure it out. Which they do a pretty good job for all things considered. For 2000, they do a pretty good job. So for me, I would recommend. I already alluded to it, The Life of Brian, which is like I think, as I said, it has more to say, and it's a fucking Monty Python movie. But and then the other one is one that I don't think many people saw, but I want to highlight. It's called The Book of Clarence. And it came out last year, maybe the year before. Before it was actually finished, I saw a rough cut of it when I worked at TIFF. And it's a biblical epic, but it stars an almost exclusively African-American cast. So it's directed by a guy called James Samuel, who is a British filmmaker and like singer-songwriter. He does everything. But it stars Lakeith Stanfield, which I think for most people is enough. Omar Sy, David Oyelowo, Alfred Woodard, and then James McAvoy actually plays like the Roman centurion type character. And then Benedict Cumberbatch is also in it playing...
Wow, what a cast.
And I almost don't want to spoil the Benedict Cumberbatch character. Benedict Cumberbatch is literally in the movie for like maybe 2 or 3 minutes. But this is very much a satirical look at Christianity and also kind of plays with this idea of like, why is the Jesus that we always see, why does he look like a BG? Like, why is he a white guy? He probably was a black guy. And so I thought it was really, really interesting, really entertaining. It's very different, obviously. Like, there's musical numbers in this movie. Like it's kind of hard to describe. I went into it not having any expectations and really enjoyed it. And it kind of just like came and went. So that's why I want to shout it out. I think more people should see it. Because again, it's very much, I don't like these kind of movies. And I came away from that being like, this is actually like one of the best movies I saw that year.
Yeah. Well, you know, like you said, I mean, what this movie really needed was Jar Jar Binks and more musical numbers. And then I think you might have been a happier camper throughout.
Yeah, exactly. Well, with that brings us to the conclusion of this epic episode of the Springfield Googleplex, the movie podcast for Simpson fans.
Yeah, I think we've hit the runtime of Ben-Hur at this point.
No, we're not quite, but maybe. If you enjoyed what you heard, please leave us a review and share this episode with the Simpson fans and film buffs in your life. We've also set up a support page on our website where if you want, you can throw us a couple bucks to help cover the cost of making this show, like Jesse from Portland did. Jesse, thank you so much for your support. As for the chicken coop, we'll get right on that. Nate's already picking out paints. He's just, he wants to make sure he gets the nicest, most chicken coopiest colors. But in all seriousness, thank you for the support. It means a lot and helps cover the costs of making this show. Next episode, we'll be doing our annual Oscars special. So we take a break from the Simpsons parodies. We take a break from sort of the classics and get to sort of talk about few more contemporary films for a change, but then don't worry, after that we'll be back to the classics version of this show. Don't worry, but I'm looking forward to sort of unpacking this year's Oscar season because it's an interesting number of films they've chosen this year, and I've got a lot of work to do ahead of me because I'm very far behind.
For sure. And we'll get to talk about some of the other movies that we've really enjoyed this year that didn't necessarily get nominated for the Oscars. Like, I don't know, like Challengers or something like that.
Something like that.
But yeah, and then we'll also, do a little bit of talking about The Simpsons and the Oscars as we always like to do. So yeah, I think that's going to be a really fun episode.
Yeah, with Conan hosting, there are opportunities for Simpsons-esque hilarity to ensue, so we'll see.
You bet.
But until next time, Nate?
We'll see you around the Plex.
Arrgh, my groin!
It stinks! I wasn't even going to attempt a John Lovett's impression, but...
It stinks!
It stinks! It stinks!
Yes, Mr. Sherman, everything stinks.
Yes, I do. I love Jay. I enjoy Jay. Okay, 2 hours and 42 minutes.